Kapitel 1: Der Besucher im Nebel. Im trüben November des Jahres 1889 wurde ich zum ersten Mal auf die merkwürdige Affäre des Glasäugigen aufmerksam, eine Affäre, die ich trotz ihrer außergewöhnlichen Umstände und der heiklen Natur ihrer Enthüllungen endlich hier schildern darf. Obwohl diese Angelegenheit eine der merkwürdigsten in meiner langen Zusammenarbeit mit Mr. Sherlock Holmes war, wurde sie nie zuvor ans Tageslicht gebracht, aus Gründen, die dem aufmerksamen Leser im Laufe der Erzählung klar werden. An diesem Morgen lag dichter Nebel über der Baker Street, einer jener dichten, gelben Dunstschwaden, die an den Laternenmasten haften und selbst die vertrauteste Durchgangsstraße in eine veränderliche Traumlandschaft aus Schatten und Dunst verwandeln. Vom Fenster unseres Wohnzimmers in der Nummer 224b konnte ich nichts erkennen außer den verschwommenen Umrissen der gegenüberliegenden Häuser, geisterhaft und verzerrt durch den Rauchschleier. Das Feuer brannte munter in unserem Kamin und warf einen warmen Schein auf Holmes, der im Schneidersitz auf dem Teppich saß und mit seinen langen, dünnen Fingern mit höchster Konzentration ein Stück Schnur und eine gebogene Büroklammer bearbeitete. »Sie werden bemerken, Watson«, sagte er, ohne den Blick zu heben, »dass ein Knoten, einmal von einer nervösen Hand geknüpft, weit mehr über seinen Urheber verraten kann als die Handschrift von einem Dutzend Briefen.« »Wirklich, Holmes?« fragte ich und legte die Morgenzeitung beiseite. »Und was sagt Ihnen dieser spezielle Knoten?« »Dass der Knotenmacher Linkshänder war, dass er an einem durch übermäßigen Chloralkonsum hervorgerufenen Zittern leidet und dass er ein Seemann im Dienste seiner Majestät ist oder war.« Ich musste lächeln. »Das alles haben Sie aus einer Schnurschlaufe abgeleitet?« »Aus der Schlaufe, aus der Festigkeit des Knotens und aus der merkwürdigen Ausfransung des Endes«, sagte er und hielt das Knoten gegen das Licht. »Elementar, mein lieber Watson. Obwohl ich nicht erwarte, dass Scotland Yard meine Methoden in absehbarer Zeit übernimmt.« Bevor ich eine Antwort formulieren konnte, ertönte das Geräusch eiliger Schritte auf der Treppe. Mrs. Hudsons Klopfen folgte fast unmittelbar an die Tür, und einen Moment später führte sie einen Mann herein, dessen Aussehen so bemerkenswert war, dass selbst Holmes, normalerweise der unbeeindruckbarste Beobachter, aufsprang. Er war groß, hager und überaus blass, mit einer hohen, kahlen Stirn und tiefliegenden Augen, die unnatürlich hell leuchteten. Doch was die Aufmerksamkeit am meisten auf sich zog, war das linke Auge. Ein Glasauge, mit ungewöhnlicher Kunstfertigkeit geformt, dem jedoch jener subtile Glanz des Lebens fehlte, der das natürliche Organ auszeichnet. Die Kleidung des Fremden war zwar aus gutem Stoff, aber unordentlich und reisefleckig. Seine behandschuhten Hände zitterten, als er den Hut abnahm, und der schwache Geruch von feuchtem Nebel und Droschkenrauch umgab ihn. »Mr. Sherlock Holmes, nehme ich an«, sagte er mit leiser, seltsam ungleichmäßiger Stimme. »Mein Name«, erwiderte Holmes und verbeugte sich leicht. »Und dies ist mein Freund und Kollege, Dr. Watson. Bitte nehmen Sie Platz. Sie scheinen in Eile gewesen zu sein.« »Das habe ich in der Tat«, sagte der Mann und ließ sich in den Sessel am Kamin fallen. »Und ich fürchte, ich bringe eine ebenso verwirrende wie gefährliche Geschichte mit. Ich komme, Sir, vom South Bank, aus Lambeth, wo sich gestern Abend ein höchst schreckliches Ereignis ereignet hat.« Holmes nahm wieder Platz und heftete seinen scharfen Blick auf unseren Besucher. »Bitte fahren Sie fort, Mr. C. Dunwoody. Edmund Dunwoody, früher bei der Handelsfirma Chiswell & Grant.« Holmes neigte den Kopf. »Ich höre zu, Mr. Dunwoody.« Der Mann befeuchtete seine Lippen, bevor er fortfuhr. »Es geht um den Tod meines Kollegen, Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. Er wurde heute Morgen tot in seiner Wohnung aufgefunden. Die Polizei spricht von Selbstmord. Ich schwöre, es war Mord.« Holmes legte die Fingerspitzen aneinander. »Mord? Und worauf stützen Sie diese Behauptung?« »Der Zustand der Leiche, Sir, und die übersehenen Beweise. Penhaligon wurde mit einem Revolver in der rechten Hand gefunden, obwohl er Linkshänder war. Außerdem war die Tür von innen verschlossen, aber der Schlüssel fehlte. Der Polizist erklärt die Sache für einfach. »Ich erkläre sie für unmöglich.« »In der Tat«, murmelte Holmes. »Ein verschlossenes Zimmer, ein fehlender Schlüssel und eine verkehrte Händigkeit, eine vielversprechende Dreifaltigkeit.« Mr. Dunwoodys Glasauge schien Holmes mit seltsamer Intensität zu fixieren. »Da ist noch mehr, Mr. Holmes. Auf dem Schreibtisch wurde eine Notiz gefunden. Ein paar hastig hingekritzelte Worte. Er sieht durch Glas, was andere nicht sehen. Niemand kann sich einen Reim darauf machen.« Einen langen Moment lang sagte Holmes nichts. Sein Blick wanderte zum Feuer, und ich konnte an der leichten Pressung seiner Lippen erkennen, dass sein großer Geist bereits sein Netz spinnte. »Watson«, sagte er schließlich, »erinnern Sie sich an das Musgrave-Ritual? Ein Schlüssel, der offen vor aller Augen versteckt war. Und an den merkwürdigen Vorfall mit dem Daumen des Ingenieurs, bei dem eine einfache Maschine ein komplexes Verbrechen verriet. Diese Affäre könnte ähnlicher Natur sein.« Plötzlich wandte er sich unserem Besucher zu. »Sie sprachen von einem Glasauge, Mr. Dunwoody. Verzeihen Sie die Störung, aber besaß Ihr Freund, Mr. Penhaligon, einen solchen Gegenstand?« »In der Tat nicht«, sagte Dunwoody überrascht. »Warum fragen Sie?« Holmes stand auf und ging vor dem Kaminvorleger auf und ab. Weil es in der englischen Literatur nur wenige Hinweise auf das Sehen durch Glas gibt, die nicht metaphorisch gemeint sind, und noch weniger, die tragisch enden. Der Mann fuhr sich mit zitternder Hand über die Stirn. »Sie sprechen in Rätseln, Mr. Holmes. Können Sie mir helfen?« Holmes hielt abrupt inne, seine Augen blitzten vor altem Feuer. »Ihnen helfen. Mein lieber Herr, Sie haben mir genau die Art von Koffer gebracht, die mir das Blut in Wallung bringt. Ich fahre noch heute Nachmittag nach Lambeth.« Er wandte sich mir zu. »Watson, Ihren Revolver und Ihren Mantel, wenn ich bitten darf. Im Nebel ist Unheil im Gange.« Keine Stunde später saßen wir in einer Droschke und ratterten durch den dichter werdenden Nebel Richtung Süden. Die Lampe des Kutschers glühte schwach in der Dunkelheit, und das Klappern der Hufe hallte hohl vom Kopfsteinpflaster wider. Holmes saß schweigend da, sein hageres Gesicht halb im Schatten des aufsteigenden Nebels. Ein- oder zweimal murmelte er vor sich hin, dann versank er wieder in Gedanken. Schließlich, als wir die Westminster Bridge überquerten, sprach er: »Haben Sie den Blick unseres Besuchers bemerkt, Watson?« »Unmöglich.« »Ganz recht. Und haben Sie das Zittern seiner Hand bemerkt?« »Ja, obwohl ich es auf Angst zurückführte.« »Vielleicht. Oder vielleicht auch nicht.« Holmes beugte sich vor und senkte die Stimme. »Ich bin überzeugt, dass unser Mr. Dunwoody viel mehr über diese Angelegenheit weiß, als er zugibt.« Als er von der Nachricht sprach, beschleunigte sich sein Puls, und sein gutes Auge verriet Angst. Nicht vor Mord, sondern davor, entdeckt zu werden. »Vor was?« rief ich aus. »Genau das, mein Lieber, werden wir versuchen herauszufinden.« Kurz darauf erreichten wir eine düstere Sackgasse abseits der Lambeth Road, wo eine Gruppe von Polizisten und Schaulustigen vor einem schmalen Eingang stand. Ein Polizist erkannte Holmes sofort und führte uns mit einer respektvollen Berührung seines Helms nach oben in ein Zimmer, das im dämmerigen Nachmittagslicht nur spärlich erleuchtet war. Der Raum war ordentlich, zu ordentlich, wie Holmes bemerkte, bis auf den Schreibtisch, auf dem ein Revolver, ein paar verstreute Papiere und ein kleiner Spiegel lagen, dessen Vorderseite zerbrochen war. Auf dem Boden, neben dem Kamin, lag ein einzelner Manschettenknopf, aus Gold mit einem Muster, das ich nicht erkennen konnte. Holmes' Augen glänzten. »Ah, Watson«, sagte er leise, »das Spiel hat wieder begonnen.« Und so begann der Fall des Glasäugigen, ein Fall, der selbst Holmes' beeindruckenden Intellekt auf die Probe stellen sollte und der vor seinem Ende die seltsamste Täuschung enthüllen sollte, deren Zeuge ich in meiner ganzen Bekanntschaft mit diesem außergewöhnlichen Mann je geworden bin. Kapitel 2 Das verschlossene Zimmer in Lambeth. Von all den unzähligen Räumen, die mein Freund und ich im Laufe unserer gemeinsamen Abenteuer besichtigt haben, sind mir nur wenige so deutlich in Erinnerung geblieben wie das Zimmer in Lambeth, in dem der unglückliche Arthur Penhaligon sein Ende fand. Ich kann die Augen schließen und es mir vorstellen. Die schmale Treppe mit ihrem abgenutzten Läufer, den Geruch von feuchtem Putz, der Häusern eigen ist, die sich in den Flussnebel neigen, und die Tür am Treppenabsatz, auf deren Messingschlüsselschild ein Rußfleck lag, wie der Abdruck einer behandschuhten Hand. Die Lampe des Polizisten, die auf einem Flurtisch stand, warf einen dünnen Lichtstrahl, der bei jeder Bewegung flatterte, so daß selbst die Schatten zu atmen schienen. »Da wären wir, meine Herren«, sagte der Polizist, ein kräftiger Kerl mit einem Bulldoggenkinn. »Der Arzt hat ihn gesehen. Inspektor Lestrade ist unterwegs. Man hat mir gesagt, ich soll Sie einlassen, Mr. Holmes, sofern Sie die Vorbereitungen nicht behindern.« Holmes neigte den Kopf mit jener kühlen Höflichkeit, die ihn, wie ich gestehen muss, bei der Polizei selten beliebt machte. »Wir werden nicht behindern, mein Lieber. Das überlassen wir Scotland Yard.« Leichtfüßig wie eine Katze schritt er über die Schwelle, mich dicht auf den Fersen. Der Raum selbst war bescheiden und mit anständiger Sparsamkeit eingerichtet. Ein Schreibtisch am Fenster, ein Kohlenrost mit 2 Petroleumlampen auf dem Kaminsims, ein schmales Bett mit einer grauen Wolldecke und auf einem kleinen Beistelltisch ein Porzellankrug mit Waschschüssel. Zwischen Kamin und Schreibtisch lag ein geflochtener Teppich. Das Fenster war mit Vorhängen verhängt. Die Scheiben wirkten durch den Nebel dahinter milchiger, und der billige Gasbrenner über mir spendete ein schwaches, grünliches Licht, das den Anblick der Leiche nicht gerade verschönerte. Penhaligon lag auf der rechten Seite, halb im Schatten, halb von der Gasflamme beleuchtet, die Wange an den geflochtenen Teppich gepresst, als lausche er auf dem Boden nach Geheimnissen. Den Revolver hielt er noch in der rechten Hand. An seiner Schläfe war getrocknetes Blut, und wo die Kugel eingedrungen war, war eine schreckliche schwarze Öffnung. Eine steife, verfilzte und verklebte Locke braunen Haares klebte an der Haut. Ich konnte sie nicht lange ansehen, Holmes jedoch ersparte mir den Anblick nicht. Er kniete nieder, als betete er, obwohl niemand weniger zu dieser Übung neigte, und beugte sich vor, bis sein Gesicht fast das des Toten berührte. »Ah«, sagte er leise, »Cordit und außerdem, Watson, deine Nase.« Ich beugte mich hinunter und erwartete den gleichen scharfen Pulvergeruch. Stattdessen nahm ich darunter einen schwachen medizinischen Geruch wahr, nicht unähnlich einem frisch gewischten Krankenhausflur. Ein Geruch, kaum wahrnehmbar, aber unverkennbar für jemanden, der schon einmal durch die Krankenstationen gegangen war. »Carbol«, sagte ich, sehr schwach. Holmes' Augen leuchteten. Er führte seine Lupe an die Wunde, dann an die Lippen des Mannes, dann an die Handfläche seiner rechten Hand, die den Revolver umklammerte. »Erlauben Sie«, murmelte er und hob mit einem weißen Leinentuch, das er aus der Tasche zog, vorsichtig die Hand an und untersuchte die Haut zwischen Daumen und Zeigefinger. »Da sind Pulverflecken«, sagte ich, »aber nicht so deutlich, wie ich gesehen habe.« »Genau«, sagte Holmes, »und was noch wichtiger ist, beachten Sie, dass die Pulverkörner nicht in die Haut getrieben werden, wie es der Fall wäre, wenn die Mündung in unmittelbarer Nähe wäre und der Schuss von ihm stammte.« Er ließ die Hand los, die mit schrecklicher, knochenloser Resignation nach hinten fiel. »Wir lassen uns nicht drängen, Watson. Die Toten rühren sich nicht.« Er stand auf und ging zum Schreibtisch. Dort lag das Revolvergehäuse, offen und leer, eine zweite Petroleumlampe, 2 Blätter Briefpapier, fleckig und zerrissen, ein Stift, der so sorgfältig wie ein Chirurgenskalpell auf dem Ständer lag, und ein kleiner Handspiegel, dessen versilberte Oberfläche, wie ich bereits erzählte, von einem Ende zum anderen gesprungen war. Daneben, auf der Schreibunterlage, lag die Nachricht, die unseren Besucher so verblüfft hatte. Er sieht durch Glas, was andere nicht sehen können. Holmes beugte sich über die Nachricht. Er berührte es nicht, aber er roch daran, was mir absurd erschien, bis er fast zu sich selbst sagte: Zähflüssige schwarze Tinte, vielleicht Stevens Blauschwarz in seiner älteren, teerigen Formulierung. Die Feder ist fein, neu, obwohl die Hand, die sie führte, ungeübt oder unruhig ist. Kein Klecksen. Nein, das ist interessant. Ich hatte mir in den Jahren seiner Gesellschaft angewöhnt, ihn nicht zu bedrängen, wenn er solche orakelhaften Sätze von sich gab. Stattdessen ließ ich meinen Blick zum Kamin wandern. Der Rost war warm. Eine Kohle war in rote Blütenblätter zerbrochen, die zwinkerten und seufzten. Auf dem eisernen Kaminsims, höchstens einen halben Meter rechts von der Öffnung, befand sich ein Schmierer einer blassen Substanz, wie getrocknetes Wachs, kaum größer als mein Daumennagel. Ich bückte mich darüber. »Holmes«, sagte ich, »mach das.« »Aha.« Sofort war er an meiner Seite. »Fassen Sie es nicht an, Watson. Denken Sie an die Lektion mit dem Ring des Bischofs von Chichester.« Er kniete nieder, richtete seine Lupe darauf und stieß ein zufriedenes Grunzen aus. »Paraffin, glaube ich. Derselbe Fleck ist hier am unteren Scharnier des Schreibtischs zu sehen. Und noch einmal. Wo? Wir werden sehen.« Er stand auf und musterte den Raum. Sein Blick wanderte zum Bett, dem Krug, dem Gaskessel und dann zum Fenster. Er ging mit 3 Schritten hinüber und untersuchte den Fensterflügel. »Von innen verschlossen«, sagte er, »mit der üblichen Sicherung. Der Staub auf dem Fensterbrett ist aufgewirbelt. 1, 2 Streifen. Aber das könnte vom ungeschickten Ellbogen des Polizisten stammen. Der Beschlag würde jeden Zeugen daran hindern, hinein oder hinauszusehen. Sehen Sie sich die Scheibe an, Watson.« Ich schaute und sah nichts. Erst als er den Vorhang mit äußerster Sorgfalt zurechtrückte, zeigte sich ein schwacher ovaler Fleck auf der Scheibe, so groß wie ein zusammengepresstes Männerauge. »Sehr gut«, sagte Holmes. »Ein Mann hat in Eile nach draußen geschaut. Welcher Mann? Und wann?« »Das Auge hinterlässt seine eigene Signatur, doch leider hat der Nebel die feineren Striche verwischt.« Er kehrte zum Schreibtisch zurück. »Er sieht durch Glas, was andere nicht sehen. Merkwürdig.« In diesem Moment klopfte es heftig an den Türpfosten, und herein sauste Inspektor Lestrade von Scotland Yard. Seine scharfen Gesichtszüge und seine vogelartige Helligkeit passten seltsamerweise nicht zu seiner kleinen, stämmigen Gestalt. Er strahlte Holmes auf eine Art an, die mir sagte, dass er sich bereits entschieden hatte. »Nun, Mr. Holmes und Doktor«, sagte er fröhlich und stellte seinen Bowler mit einer Sicherheit auf den Schreibtisch, die mich zusammenzucken ließ. »Ich muss Ihnen danken, dass Sie Ihre Hände bei sich behalten. Sie kommen wie üblich gerade rechtzeitig, um meine Schlussfolgerung zu bestätigen.« »Und zwar«, erwiderte Holmes gelassen, »dass Mr. Arthur Penhaligon sich das Leben genommen hat. Hier sind die Fakten, so wie wir sie kennen. Er wurde in einem von innen gesicherten Zimmer gefunden. Er hält einen Revolver in der Hand. Es gibt eine Nachricht, die, wenn auch kein Geständnis, so doch zumindest ein Zeichen für einen Geisteszustand ist. Die Putzfrau hörte ihn um 2 Uhr morgens herumlaufen und mit sich selbst reden. Als sie um 7 zurückkam, war die Tür verschlossen. Auf Befehl des Sergeanten brachen wir sie auf und fanden ihn, wie Sie sehen. »Eine kleine Schwierigkeit«, sagte Holmes, »wenn Sie mir bitte das Fehlen des Schlüssels erklären würden.« »Ins Feuer geworfen«, erwiderte Lestrade prompt. »Das ist klar genug. Die Kohlen wurden neu geschaufelt. Er ist in der Asche verloren gegangen.« Holmes' Augenlider fielen zu. »Und der lose Manschettenknopf auf dem Boden?« »Ein Schmuckstück eines Gentlemans, das vor Tagen heruntergefallen ist«, sagte Lestrade mit einer Handbewegung. »Es gehört ihm, ganz sicher.« Holmes nahm es zwischen Daumen und Zeigefinger. Es war oval, aus Gelbgold, und auf der Vorderseite befand sich ein winziges Symbol, das ich erst entziffern konnte, als er es gegen das Gas hielt. Dann erblickte ich etwas, das wie ein winziges Auge aussah. Ein Oculus, umgeben von Strahlen wie die Sonne auf einem Kinderbild. »Nicht unansehnlich«, sagte Holmes und drehte es. »Aber Ihre Hypothese, Inspektor, setzt voraus, dass sich ein Linkshänder mit der rechten Hand erschoss. Ich bin bereit, Ihnen vieles zu glauben, aber ich gestehe, das strapaziert meine Loyalität.« »Woher wissen Sie, dass er Linkshänder war?« fragte Lestrade. Holmes lächelte leicht. »Wenn Sie das Tintenfass und den Platz der Feder, die Abnutzung auf der Schreibtischoberfläche, die Richtung des Kratzers auf dem bereits befleckten Papier und vor allem die Hornhaut am ersten Fingerglied des linken Zeigefingers des Verstorbenen untersuchen, was Sie natürlich bereits getan haben, werden Sie die Tatsache nicht in Frage stellen?« »Nein?« »Nun denn.« Lestrade errötete leicht. »Ein Mann in seiner Not ist nicht sorgfältig in der Wahl seiner Hände. Außerdem ist da noch die Notiz. Sie ist nichts weiter als das Gerede eines Geistes, der durch geschäftliche Rückschläge aus dem Gleichgewicht geraten ist.« »Geschäftliche Rückschläge?« Holmes' Stimme wurde um Haaresbreite schärfer. »Ja, Mr. Penhaligon und ein gewisser Mr. Edmund Dunwoody, Sie haben vielleicht schon von ihm gehört, ein Kerl mit einem Glasauge, waren kürzlich in ihrer Firma Chiswell & Grant wegen einer verloren gegangenen Lieferung in Streit geraten. Es gab Gerüchte über Unregelmäßigkeiten, einen Streit in ihren Büros am Montag und gestern ein Gespräch mit ihrem Versandangestellten, der inzwischen verschwunden ist. Solche Angelegenheiten gehen einem auf die Nerven.« Holmes' lange Finger begannen sich wie gewohnt zu spitzen. »Ihr Wissen spricht für Sie, Inspektor. Sie haben mit diesem Mr. Dunwoody gesprochen.« »Ich habe ihn noch nicht gesehen, obwohl er nach Ihnen geschickt hat. Wir werden ihn in Kürze besuchen. Sie werden ihn mit ausgezeichneten Manieren vorfinden«, sagte Holmes träge, »und mit einer höchst interessanten optischen Technik. Wenn Sie in der Zwischenzeit den Gastgeber spielen möchten, gestatten Sie mir eine halbe Stunde mit Ihrem Fotografen und einem anständigen Sieb.« »Ein Sieb?« »Der Kamin«, sagte Holmes wie zu einem Kind. »Kein Kamin verschlingt freiwillig einen Messingschlüssel.« Lestrade lachte kurz und ungläubig, schickte aber trotzdem einen Mann nach einem Sieb. Während wir warteten, bewegte sich Holmes in seiner ruhelosen, schweigsamen Art im Zimmer auf und ab. Er untersuchte den Gasalier mit einer Zärtlichkeit, die einem Bräutigam gebührt hätte. Er kniete sich neben das Bett und schob eine Hand unter die Matratze, wobei eine winzige Staubwolke und die Skelettreste einer Motte zum Vorschein kamen. Er maß den Abstand vom Teppich zum Schreibtisch mit der Länge seines Fußes, und schließlich hob er mit besonderer Behutsamkeit den zerbrochenen Spiegel an und spähte auf die Rückseite. »Was halten Sie von diesem Spiegel, Watson?« fragte er und hielt es mir hin. »Es ist schlampig verarbeitet«, sagte ich und drehte es gegen das Licht. »Die Versilberung ist schlecht aufgetragen. Der Riss deutet auf einen Schlag hin.« »Von innen oder außen?« »Der Riss verläuft von rechts oben nach links unten«, sagte ich. »Würde ein Mann davor stehen und mit der rechten Hand dagegen schlagen, würde der Schlag wahrscheinlich von links nach rechts erfolgen. Dies scheint von der anderen Seite zu sein.« Holmes' Augen flackerten. »Sehr gut, mein Lieber.« Er legte den Spiegel weg und holte aus seiner Tasche eine kleine zylindrische Dose. Daraus streute er eine Prise grauen Puders auf die Schreibtischoberfläche neben dem Zettel und hauchte ganz leicht. Eine Ansammlung winziger Flecken wurde sichtbar, angeordnet entlang der Kante der Schreibunterlage und über das polierte Holz. »Wer, frage ich mich«, murmelte er, »hat die Angewohnheit, seine Finger genauso abzulegen, während er sich zum Lesen vorbeugt? Nicht unsere Leiche. Seine Hand ist zu groß, nicht Lestrade, denn er war noch nicht auf dieser Seite des Schreibtisches. Unser Polizist? Nein, die Form ist anders, und hier, sehen Sie, Watson, der Abdruck eines Rings, nicht am üblichen Finger, sondern am kleinsten. Nur eine Frau trägt einen Ring so, und nur eine ganz besondere Art von Frau würde einen so dünnen tragen. Ah, hier ist unser Sieb.« Wir versammelten uns am Kamin, während Lestrades Mann, ein hagerer junger Mann mit Ohren wie Segel, die Asche in einen Eimer siebte. Nach einer Minute öden Kratzens ertönte ein metallisches Klirren. Der Junge grinste und hielt seine Beute hoch. Einen Messingschlüssel, verfärbt, aber intakt. Holmes nahm ihn mit einer kleinen Verbeugung entgegen. »Sehen Sie, Inspektor, Ihr Feuer ist nicht so gierig, wie Sie dachten. Na, passt er denn?« Ja, er passte. Lestrade steckte ihn selbst in das Schlüsselloch der Innentür und drehte ihn. Er rastete sauber ein. Er starrte verblüfft. »Nachträglich eingeworfen«, sagte Holmes leichthin, »von jemandem, der den Anschein eines Selbstmords verstärken wollte. Aber es gibt ein Problem. Die Tür war von innen verschlossen, sagten Sie. Der Riegel ist einfach. Der Schlüssel muss auch drinnen gewesen sein.« Lestrade riss sich zusammen. Also ein Faden durchs Schlüsselloch. Solche Tricks kenne ich aus Groschenromanen. Tatsächlich? Holmes' Stimme nahm jene trockene Belustigung an, die ich mittlerweile so zu schätzen gelernt hatte. Dann erlauben Sie mir, Ihre Aufmerksamkeit auf das Schlüsselloch zu lenken. Beachten Sie, dass es mit einer Staubkappe versehen ist, die, wenn man sie von außen anhebt, eine Schmutzspur auf der Platte hinterlassen hätte. Eine solche Spur ist nicht vorhanden. Der Faden passte also nicht hindurch. Wie dann? Ein anderer Trick. Einer, der ein wenig Paraffin und einen kühlen Kopf erforderte. Er warf mir einen Seitenblick zu und dann wieder weg, als stünde er kurz vor einer Erklärung. »Aber kommen Sie, es ist noch früh.« Lestrade gab ein verärgertes Geräusch von sich. »Mit Ihren Zauberkünsten sind Sie immer einen Schritt voraus. Wenn Sie eine Theorie haben, Mr. Holmes, dann teilen Sie sie mir bitte mit.« »Ich habe eine Hypothese«, erwiderte Holmes. »Eine Theorie erfordert Beweise. Im Moment habe ich nur ein Bildfragment. Aber in einem Punkt bin ich mir sicher. Die Hand, die diese Nachricht geschrieben hat, ist nicht die Hand, die normalerweise in Saint und Eternit diesem Zimmer geschrieben hat.« »Wie zum Teufel?« »Weil«, sagte Holmes, »ich Augen habe und sie benutze.« In diesem Moment klopfte es an der offenen Tür und das Gesicht einer Frau erschien. Blass, schmal, mit rot geränderten Augen und einer Haube, die einmal weiß gewesen war. Sie knickste ungeschickt. »Verzeihung, Sir«, sagte sie. »Ich bin Mrs. Biddle. Ich bin für Mr. Penhaligon. Man sagte mir, Mr. Holmes sei hier. Können Sie, Sir?« »Oh, der arme Herr!« Holmes' Verhalten änderte sich schlagartig. Er kann so sanft sein wie jeder andere, wenn die Situation es erfordert. »Bitte, Mrs. Biddle, nehmen Sie Platz. Wir werden Sie nicht lange aufhalten. Sie sagen, Sie sind für ihn da. Haben Sie gestern hier geputzt?« »Ja, Sir, nachmittags.« Er war nicht er selbst, zumindest nicht in letzter Zeit. Er ging auf und ab und redete leise mit sich selbst. Und gestern war Mr. Dunwoody bei ihm, der Herr mit dem feinen Hut und dem Auge. War Mr. Dunwoody oft hier? In letzter Zeit nicht so oft. Es gab ein Wortgefecht, Sir, und dann sagte mir Mr. Penhaligon, ich solle ihn nicht einlassen, wenn er wiederkäme, es sei denn, er nenne seinen Namen Finch. Ich stellte keine Fragen, ich bin eine anständige Frau. »Finch?« wiederholte Holmes. »Ein komischer Vogel. Und gab es noch anderen Besuch?« Der Blick der Frau huschte zum Schreibtisch. »Nur die Dame, Sir.« Lestrade spitzte die Ohren. »Dame?« »Eine schöne. Sie kam in einer Kutsche, gerade in der Dämmerung und ging geradewegs hinauf. Sie trug einen Schleier und sprach leise, so als ob. Ich bot ihr Tee an, aber sie wollte ihn nicht. Sie war höchstens eine halbe Stunde hier.« »Welcher Tag?« fragte Holmes. »Gestern, Sir, ich habe sie allein gelassen. Als ich zurückkam, um zu sagen, dass ich über Nacht bei meiner Schwester wäre, ihr geht es schlecht, Sir, war sie weg und er schrieb. Ich habe ihn nie wieder lebend gesehen. Haben Sie etwas an Ihren Händen bemerkt?« Holmes' Frage kam so plötzlich und so gezielt, dass die Frau zusammenzuckte. »Ihre Hände?« Mrs. Biddle kniff die Augen zusammen. »Sie waren blass und klein, Sir, und sie trug einen kleinen Ring am Zeigefinger, nicht größer als ein Draht.« Holmes warf mir einen flüchtigen Blick zu. »Danke. Sie sind eine sehr aufmerksame Frau. Wenn Sie dem Inspektor Ihre Anweisungen geben würden, wird man Sie widerrufen.« Als sie gegangen war, konnte Lestrade seine Freude nicht länger unterdrücken. »Da, Mr. Holmes, eine Dame, ein Streit, eine Nachricht und eine verschlossene Tür. Es ist klar wie gedruckt. Er wurde von seiner eigenen Verzweiflung zu Fall gebracht.« Holmes sah ihn an, wie ein Schulmeister den Jungen ansieht, der seine Lektion selbstbewusst, aber verständnislos aufsagt. »Ihr Eifer ist lobenswert, Inspektor. Ich persönlich akzeptiere niemals Drucke, die von einem unbekannten Schriftsetzer gesetzt wurden. Watson, Ihren Hut, wir gehen in die Luft.« »In die Luft?« wiederholte Lestrade verblüfft. »Wohin gehen Sie jetzt?« »Um einen Mann zu konsultieren, der blind und sehend zugleich ist. Kommen Sie, Watson. Wir haben eine kleine Verabredung in der St. Martin's Lane, und danach schlage ich einen Besuch bei den Herren Chiswell & Grant vor.« »Blind und sehend?« ich fragte, als wir die Treppe hinuntergingen. Holmes' Lippen bewegten sich kaum. »Ein Optiker, mein Lieber. Haben Sie das Muster auf dem Manschettenknopf nicht markiert? Das Auge in der Sonne ist das Firmenzeichen von Qualis, dem Linsenmacher. Wenn Penhaligon mit Qualis Geschäfte macht, werden wir davon hören. Und wenn nicht, verrät uns das Zeichen, dass jemand in diesem Zimmer Geschäfte gemacht hat. Wir traten wieder in die gelbe Dämmerung des Nachmittags hinaus, wo die Lampen bereits wie blasse Monde im Nebel leuchteten. Holmes rief mit seiner eigentümlichen Pfeife eine Droschke an und ließ mich einsteigen. Als wir davonrüttelten, versank er in jenes tiefe Schweigen, das mehr als jedes seiner Worte die Arbeit seines Geistes verkündete. Lestrade wird seiner Dame den Hof machen, wagte ich nach einer Weile zu sagen. Das wird er, sagte Holmes, denn sie soll verfolgt werden. 3 Ungereimtheiten lassen sich nicht mit Selbstmord vereinbaren. Der Kabolgeruch, die Anordnung des Schreibtisches und... Er klopfte leicht auf seine Brusttasche, in der er, wie ich jetzt bemerkte, im Laufe unserer Inspektion einen kleinen Gegenstand versteckt hatte. Dieses. Was ist es, Holmes? Er sah mich eher durch als an, als wäre ich eine Scheibe und das größere Wunder läge dahinter. Eine Kleinigkeit, sagte er. Und doch, mein lieber Watson, sind Kleinigkeiten die Scharniere, an denen sich große Türen drehen. Mal sehen, ob diese hier Lambeth aufschließt oder nur eine weitere Kammer voller Geheimnisse öffnet. Er erklärte es nicht weiter, und ich kannte ihn zu gut, um ihn zu bedrängen. Die Räder ratterten, der Atem des Pferdes dampfte, und die unzähligen Stimmen der Stadt wurden vom Nebel zu einem dumpfen Rauschen gedämpft. Neben mir saß Holmes wie ein aus grauem Stein gemeißeltes Bild, sein Profil streng, sein Blick in die Ferne gerichtet. So machten wir uns in der Dämmerung jenes seltsamen Tages auf die ersten wirklichen Schritte der Untersuchung, hinein in das Gewirr aus Glas und Schuld und in die merkwürdige Gesellschaft von Männern, die ihren Lebensunterhalt damit verdienen, durch Linsen zu schauen und doch nicht zu erkennen, was sich unmittelbar vor ihrer Nase befindet. Kapitel 3. Der Linsenmacher von St. Martin's Lane. Unser Taxi hielt vor der schmalen Fassade von Quarles & Sons, Optiker, gelegen in jenem merkwürdigen Teil von St. Martin's Lane, wo Instrumentenbauer, Antiquare und Kuriositätenhändler dieselbe melancholische Aura verblasster Präzision zu teilen scheinen. Über der Tür ragte ein seit langem nicht mehr benutztes Messingteleskop hervor. Das Schild darunter, mindestens vor 10 Jahren gemalt, zeigte ein von goldenen Strahlen umschlossenes Auge und darunter die Worte »Hersteller des Königlichen Observatoriums«. Die Glocke klingelte, als wir eintraten, und sofort erfüllte der trockene metallische Geruch von gemahlenem Glas und Messingpolitur unsere Sinne. Der Laden war ein düsterer, niedriger Raum, vollgestopft mit Regalen voller Okularinstrumente, Linsen in allen Größen, Mikroskope in Mahagoni-Etuis, kleine Brillen mit Farbfiltern und eine ganze Phalanx optischer Apparate, deren Zweck selbst ich nicht erraten konnte. Hinter einem mattierten Schirm brannte eine einzelne Gasflamme, deren Licht durch die träge, in der stillen Luft schwebenden Staubkörnchen bernsteinfarben gemildert wurde. Hinter dem Tresen stand ein älterer, zierlicher Mann, gebeugt wie ein gespannter Bogen. Seine überraschend zarten Hände polierten den Rand eines Messingmonokulars. Der Kopf war bis auf einen weißen Pony an den Schläfen kahl, und wenn er aufblickte, waren seine Augen flink und glänzend wie die eines Spatzen. »Mr. Quarles?« fragte Holmes. Der alte Mann neigte den Kopf, und die Geste strahlte eine subtile Würde aus. »Mein verstorbener Vater, Sir, war Mr. Quarles. Ich bin sein Sohn, John Henry. Sie werden mir die Verwirrung verzeihen. Was kann ich für Sie tun?« Holmes lehnte sich über den Tresen, und sein scharfer Blick huschte von den Instrumenten zu dem Mann selbst. Mir wurde gesagt, sie hätten künstliche Augen von außergewöhnlicher Kunstfertigkeit entworfen. Augen, die nicht nur die Symmetrie wiederherstellen, sondern in manchen Fällen auch die verbleibende Sehkraft vergrößern oder korrigieren. Habe ich das richtig verstanden? Ein Anflug von Freude huschte über das faltige Gesicht des Mannes. Ja, wir hatten Erfolg in dieser Hinsicht. Das Prinzip der Konkavlinse lässt sich nämlich mit einer verspiegelten Rückseite kombinieren, um sowohl optische Effekte zu erzielen als auch die Fokussierung zu erleichtern, vorausgesetzt die verbleibende Optik funktioniert. Aber unsere Kunden sind wenige: Matrosen, Soldaten, durch Unfälle oder Krieg Verstümmelte. Holmes nickte. Sie haben vielleicht ein solches an einen Mr. Edmund Dunwoody von der Firma Chiswell & Grant geliefert. Bei der Erwähnung des Namens stockte dem alten Optiker das Poliertuch für einen kurzen Moment. Mr. Dunwoody. Ja, vor einigen Monaten. Ein äußerst anspruchsvoller Gentleman, wenn ich das sagen darf. Er gab ein Glasauge eines besonderen Typs in Auftrag, mit einer rauchfarbenen Innenwölbung. Er sagte, es helfe ihm bei hellem Licht. »Und hat es das?« fragte Holmes, seine Stimme leicht, sein Blick aber scharf wie das Skalpell eines Chirurgen. »Das kann ich nicht sagen. Er war mit der Passform zufrieden, aber ich erinnere mich, dass er ein- oder zweimal zur Anpassung zurückkam. Er beschwerte sich, dass das Glas zu stark reflektierte, dass andere, wie er es ausdrückte, sehen könnten, was hinter ihm sei. Unsinn natürlich, obwohl es meinen Vater sehr amüsierte. »Hat er von Mr. Penhaligon gesprochen?« Der alte Mann runzelte die Stirn. »Nein, ich glaube nicht. Aber er kam einmal in Begleitung eines anderen Herrn, dunkelhaarig, kleiner, mit einem nervösen Auftreten. Er schien sich nicht gern sehen zu lassen. Es war nicht Mr. Penhaligon, falls das Ihre Frage ist.« Holmes beugte sich näher. »Beschreiben Sie ihn bitte.« »Ich erinnere mich nur daran, dass er auf einem Auge leicht verfärbt war und dort einen schwachen Fleck hatte. Er berührte seinen Hals. Wie von einer Verbrennung. Er sprach wenig. Mr. Dunwoody übernahm das Reden. »Würden Sie ihn wiedererkennen?« Der alte Mann zögerte. »Vielleicht, aber es ist schon einige Monate her.« Holmes' Blick wanderte zu einem Regal, auf dem mehrere Vitrinen standen. »Sie führen doch Aufzeichnungen, Maße, Spezifikationen, Anproben.« »Ja, Sir. Jeder Kunde ist in unserem Hauptbuch vermerkt.« Holmes' lange Finger schlossen sich. »Wäre es Ihnen unangenehm, darin nachzuschauen?« »Nicht im geringsten.« Der Optiker verschwand hinter einem Vorhang, und wir hörten ihn herumlaufen, Schubladen öffnen und schließen. Holmes wandte sich mir zu, seine Augen leuchteten. »Watson, bemerken Sie die Besonderheit? Ein Glasauge, das widerspiegelt, was dahinter ist. Darin steckt Symbolik genug für eine Predigt. Und doch, vielleicht keine bloße Metapher.« »Was, glauben Sie, hat er damit gemeint?« »Patience, my dear fellow. We are still in the vestibule of the temple.« Mr. Quarles returned bearing a ledger whose pages were yellowed and filled with neat copperplate entries. He laid it upon the counter and turned the leaves with fingers that trembled slightly. »Here, Dunwoody Edmund, fitting May 23rd, returned June 5th for adjustment. Specification: left orbital shell, grey iris, inner convex with polished backing, what my father called mirror core.« Holmes bent over the page. »And payment?« »Half in cash, half by draft on Chiswell & Grant. All duly settled.« Holmes nodded. »Thank you. You have been most obliging.« The old man looked from him to me with a puzzled expression. »Is there mischief afoot, sir? I would not wish our craft to be associated with any—« »On the contrary,« Holmes said, slipping a card across the counter. »Your assistance may prove invaluable in disentangling a very grave one. Should any person inquire after this same pattern of eye, or return it for alteration, I beg you to send immediate word to this address.« The optician promised, and Holmes bowed himself out. Once in the fog-draped street, he thrust his hands deep into the pockets of his Inverness cloak, and strode northward at a pace which forced me to half-trot beside him. »Well, Watson,« said he presently, »what do you make of that?« »Dunwoody's vanity, perhaps. A curious contrivance to render his defect less visible.« »Vanity, yes, but mixed with something subtler. The mirror core intrigues me. Imagine, if you will, a convex surface within the socket. Such an eye, properly angled, might, with the aid of a lens, allow a man to perceive movement behind him, however faintly.« »You think it possible?« »Not likely,« he admitted, »but suggestive. A man who believes he can see what is behind him might well act upon that belief, and in doing so, betray himself. We had turned into the Strand, that ceaseless artery of London's heart, where omnibuses lumbered like elephants and newsboys darted among the cabs shouting of crime and scandal. Holmes halted suddenly before a stationer's window. "Observe, Watson. Advertisements for photographic chemicals, the very solvents whose odour I detected at Lambeth. Carbolic, yes, but also collodion. There was collodion in that room. I'd stake my violin upon it. What would collodion signify? Photographic preparation, a coating for plates, or for glass." He smiled thinly. "Do you recall the cracked mirror? It was no ordinary mirror. It had been recently treated. For photography." I stared at him. Then Penhaligon was engaged in some experiment with glass and light, yes. Whether innocent or otherwise remains to be seen. But the note, he sees through glass what others cannot, begins to take on a new complexion. We continued in silence for some minutes, the fog curling about our ankles like smoke. Presently Holmes hailed another cab. "To the offices of Messrs. Chiswell and Grant," said he to the driver. "We shall pay by the clock. There is no better tutor than haste." The premises of Chiswell and Grant occupied the upper floor of a respectable building near the river. A brass plate proclaimed them export merchants in fine instruments and chemical goods. We were shown into a dim counting room where a young clerk sat at a high desk, poring over ledgers. His ink-stained cuffs and nervous manner bespoke a man long overworked. "Mr. Chiswell is absent, sir," he stammered when Holmes inquired. "Mr. Grant attends to the books, but—" He hesitated. "We have been much disordered since the death of Mr. Penhaligon." "Ah," said Holmes smoothly. "You were acquainted with him?" "I was but his clerk, sir, though a good master he was." "Poor gentleman. None deserved such an end." "You are of the opinion it was self-inflicted?" The young man's eyes widened. "The police say so, but I cannot believe it. He was troubled, yes. That Dunwoody affair weighed upon him, but not to such despair." Holmes motioned him to continue. "It was some matter of shipment," the clerk said. "A crate of optical glass, I think, bound for Rotterdam. The bills of lading went missing. Mr. Dunwoody swore Penhaligon had forged them, and Penhaligon swore the opposite. Words were said, loud ones. Then 2 days later the crate was found opened, the glass gone. Stolen, or exchanged, I cannot tell. There was talk of fraud, but Mr. Penhaligon said the matter would be set right if only he might have one more night to prove his innocence. And now—" He shook his head. "He is dead." Holmes's eyes had narrowed. "This crate? Where was it stored?" "In our cellar, sir. It was sealed under Mr. Dunwoody's direction." Holmes straightened. "Watson, I think we must view that cellar." The clerk led us down a narrow stair that smelt of dust and river damp. At the foot was a small vault lit by a single oil lamp. Against one wall stood several wooden crates, some open, some nailed fast. Upon one of these Holmes's gaze fixed instantly. A box half sawn open, its lid askew. The stenciled letters upon it read Flint Optical Glass. Quarles & Sons, London. He bent, pried loose a slat, and drew out a thin plate of glass. It was not clear like ordinary glass, but faintly iridescent, with a bluish sheen that seemed to ripple across its surface like oil on water. "Watson," said he quietly, "hold it to the light." I did so, and to my astonishment saw that the lamplight was oddly refracted, forming twin shadows upon the wall, one faint, one distinct. "A split image," Holmes murmured. "Precisely as I hoped." He replaced the pane and turned to the clerk. "Was all the glass of this sort?" "I believe so, sir." Holmes dusted his hands. "Then, my dear fellow, you are employed by a firm that traffics not in goods, but in secrets. Keep your tongue and your conscience close. Come, Watson, the fog grows thicker, and we have much to think upon." It was not until we were again in the cab, the river's murmur muffled beneath the clatter of wheels, that Holmes spoke. "Consider, Watson, a murdered man who worked with glass that splits light, a partner with an artificial eye of Miracore, and a note that speaks of seeing what others cannot. Does it not suggest some method of reflection, literal or moral, whereby one man has turned another's invention against him. You believe Dunwoody guilty, then? I believe him to be afraid, Holmes said gravely. And fear, my dear Watson, is a more transparent lens than any fashioned by human hand. He leaned back in the gloom, his hands clasped, his face lost in thought. Tomorrow we shall pay our glass-eyed gentleman a visit. But tonight I must test a theory. What theory, Holmes? He smiled faintly, his eyes glinting through the shadows. That the dead may yet look back through glass, if one knows how to see. And with that enigmatic declaration we rattled off into the thickening London night, the fog swallowing cab and thought alike, while the faint gleam of a cracked mirror seemed to hover still before my mind's eye, a silent watcher, waiting for the next revelation in the case of the glass-eyed man. Chapter 4. The House of Mirrors. I had grown accustomed over the years to Holmes's habit of beginning a new day as though the previous night's enigmas had been quietly solved in his sleep. When I came down to breakfast the next morning, the gaslight still dim against the pale London drizzle, I found him already at the table, the remains of a hasty meal pushed aside, and a curious arrangement of apparatus occupying his place. A small lantern, a convex lens, a piece of cracked mirror, the very one he had taken from the Lambeth chamber, and beside these a narrow vial of clear fluid which emitted a faint odour of ether. "Good morning, Watson," said he briskly without looking up. "You will forgive me for depriving you of the bacon. I required a clear flame. Observe." He adjusted the mirror upon its edge, angled the lantern through the lens, and produced upon the wall a faint but distinct image, the reflection of the room itself, dim and ghostly, yet with one curious feature. The right-hand corner appeared doubled, as though two images were imperfectly aligned. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "that is the same effect we saw with the glass from the cellar." "Precisely. I have coated the reverse of this mirror with a trace of collodion. It becomes what photographers call a wet plate, sensitive to light. It would seem that our late Mr. Penhaligon was experimenting with just such a technique." "But for what purpose?" Holmes smiled that small, secret smile which always meant he was nearer the truth than he wished to admit aloud. "To see what others cannot, Watson. You recall the inscription? The clue lies not in metaphor, but in optics. Penhaligon discovered a means of producing partial reflection, a surface that both reveals and conceals. Imagine a room where one may look in, yet those within see only themselves. Such a device, in unscrupulous hands, could be most profitable." He snuffed the lantern and replaced the mirror carefully in a paper envelope. "We shall require fresh air before facing our glass-eyed friend. Finish your coffee. Lestrade has kindly agreed to meet us in Lambeth by noon, though I doubt he will thank us for our interference." I smiled ruefully. "He seldom does." "True," said Holmes, "but he does so with increasing civility." The return to Lambeth. By midday the rain had ceased, but the fog remained, that stubborn yellow-grey vapour that seems to rise from the very pores of the city. The streets glistened like varnish. Horses moved with ghostly deliberation, their harnesses muffled. When we arrived at the same cul-de-sac as before, Lestrade was waiting near the door of the late Penhaligon's lodgings, his coat-collar turned up, and his expression one of thinly veiled impatience. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," said he, "you're just in time to hear that I have traced your mysterious lady." Holmes's brows rose. "Indeed?" "Indeed. Her name, it appears, is Mrs. Clara Sloane, formerly of Kensington, recently residing in rooms off the Waterloo Road. She was acquainted with the deceased through charitable work. At least so she says." Holmes gave a low whistle. "And you believe her?" Lestrade shrugged. "She was distraught, certainly. Claims she came to persuade him to surrender some papers relating to a business matter. The rest, she says, she knows nothing about." Holmes's expression was unreadable. "And what of Mr. Dunwoody?" "Not yet found. His manservant reports he left his house in Russell Square 2 nights ago and has not returned. There is talk of illness, but I think it more likely he's slipped the leash. Scotland Yard has him on watch." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Then we are in agreeable accord for once, Inspector. A missing man, a dead one, and a woman who prefers the dark to daylight. The trifecta of all good mysteries. Come, let us see what Our Lady has to say." Lestrade looked as though he might object, but curiosity got the better of him. "Very well. I've a cab waiting. Mrs. Clara Sloane." The rooms in Waterloo Road were housed in a decaying Georgian terrace, its paint the colour of old bones. The landlady, a thin woman with a face like a withered apple, admitted us after much whispering and protest that the poor lady had only just lain down. Nevertheless, a few minutes later we were shown into a small parlour where Mrs. Sloane awaited us. She was a woman of perhaps 35, dressed in mourning black, her veil drawn but not wholly concealing a face of remarkable refinement. The eyes were grey and restless, the hands clasped upon her lap, delicate and pale. When she looked up and saw Holmes, she started visibly. "Mr. Holmes," she said in a low voice, "you come concerning Mr. Penhaligon." "Among other things, madam," Holmes replied gently. "Pray accept my condolences. You were acquainted with him?" Her composure wavered. "Yes. We met last year through my late husband's business. Mr. Penhaligon was always kind. Too kind, perhaps. He assisted me when I had nothing." "Assisted you in what way?" She hesitated. "He loaned me a small sum. Later he asked me to sit for him. He said he was experimenting with light through glass, that he wished to capture reflection, not image. It was very strange. There was a mirror, and behind it—" She stopped, colour draining from her face. "Pray continue," said Holmes softly. "I cannot," she whispered. "I was sworn to secrecy. He said that what we did that night must never be spoken of, that there were men who would kill for it." Lestrade leaned forward, his tone sharper. "Mrs. Sloane, you were in his rooms the night he died. Did you see another person there?" She shook her head. "No one. I left him alive, writing at his desk. He seemed afraid, not of me, but of something he had seen." Holmes studied her closely. "Seen, you say? In the mirror?" She shivered. "Perhaps. I only know he kept looking over his shoulder as though the glass showed something behind him. When I asked what he feared, he said, 'He is watching, always watching.'" Holmes's eyes flicked to Lestrade. "He? Did he name this watcher?" "No, but he spoke of Mr. Dunwoodie. Said the man's eye was not what it seemed." Murmured Holmes. "A mirror to spy upon mirrors. Thank you, Mrs. Sloane. You have been of great assistance." She caught his sleeve suddenly, her voice trembling. "If you find who did this, promise me you will not speak my name. There are letters, papers. He told me to burn them. I did as he asked." Holmes patted her hand. "Your name shall not be uttered by me. But one final question. Did you by any chance notice a small mark upon his desk? A smear of wax, perhaps?" She looked startled. "Yes, he had a candle with a peculiar white flame, and when it burned, it left that waxy film. He said it was part of his experiments with transparency." Holmes nodded gravely. "That confirms my suspicion. Thank you, madam. Rest assured, your secret is safe." The fog returns. Outside, Lestrade was frowning beneath his bowler. "What the devil do you make of that? A candle, a mirror, and an invisible watcher? It's as mad as alchemy." "On the contrary," said Holmes, stepping into the fog. "It is science, Inspector. Perverted by greed. I begin to see the shape of the thing. A partnership in optics. Penhaligon the inventor, Dunwoodie the financier. The glass in their shipment was no mere merchandise. It was part of Penhaligon's work, lenses capable of both reflection and vision. He trusted Dunwoodie, and Dunwoodie betrayed him." Lestrade sniffed. "And your proof?" "It will come, as light comes through glass, gradually. For now we must visit Russell Square, the glass-eyed man's house." The house of Edmund Dunwoodie stood in dignified gloom behind a line of iron railings, its windows shuttered despite the noon hour. A sour-faced servant admitted us after some delay, muttering that his master was not receiving visitors. Holmes brushed past him with such authority that the fellow gave way without another word. The drawing-room into which we were shown was dark and close. A fire smouldered on the hearth, unpoked. Upon a side table stood several instruments, microscopes, prisms, and a small wooden case fitted with velvet. Holmes opened it. Within lay a second glass eye. 2, he murmured. One in his head and one in reserve. Note the difference. This one lacks the mirror core. A spare, perhaps, or a prototype. Lestrade examined it uneasily. Looks ordinary enough to me. Precisely, said Holmes, and that, Inspector, is what makes it suspicious. At that moment there was a faint sound overhead, the creak of a floorboard. Holmes froze, every sense alert. He is here, he whispered. He moved toward the staircase, and we followed. The landing above was dim, but from beneath a door at the far end came a sliver of light. Holmes approached softly, motioned us back, then turned the handle. It yielded. The room beyond was an inferno of clutter, glass plates, mirrors, chemical bottles, photographic apparatus, and at its center, hunched over a table, sat Edmund Dunwoody himself. He looked up as we entered, and for an instant the gaslight struck his glass eye so that it flashed like a coin. His face was pale, his lips dry, his hands stained with something dark. "Mr. Holmes," he said hoarsely, "I thought you might come." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then you also expected the police?" Dunwoody gave a broken laugh. "They will not understand. Penhaligon stole from me, not I from him. He would have ruined us both with his damned invention." Holmes's tone was cold as frost. "You mean the mirror that sees, the same mirror before which he died?" Dunwoody's hand trembled. "It was my idea. He perfected it, yes, but he meant to sell it abroad, to spies. I only meant to frighten him. The revolver—" He broke off, burying his face in his hands. "Enough," said Lestrade. "You'll have every chance to explain yourself at the Yard." Holmes's gaze, however, remained fixed upon the desk. "Watson, observe. The paraffin again, and a thin filament stretched from the keyhole to this armature. Ingenious. A mechanism to lock the door after firing the shot. By the heat of a candle melting the line." Lestrade gasped. "Good Lord, so it was murder." Holmes straightened, his eyes blazing. "A murder dressed as suicide, executed by reflection. The gun fired by design, the key replaced with artifice, the killer unseen behind glass. Mr. Dunwoody, you have spun a fine web, but you forgot that even the best mirror cannot hide a man's face from his own conscience." Dunwoody said nothing. He had collapsed against the table, staring into the cracked remains of a half-silvered mirror, his own distorted reflection staring back. One eye real, the other shining like an unholy lamp. Holmes turned to Lestrade. "You may take him, Inspector, but handle him gently. His punishment has already begun." Epilogue to the chapter. We left the house in silence, the fog swallowing us as though London herself sought to hide the ugliness of what she bred. Holmes walked with his hands behind him, his head bowed, until we reached the square. "You have solved it, then?" I said quietly. "Partly," he replied. "But there remains a question. Who first conceived the mirror? Penhaligon or Dunwoody? The motive may lie deeper still." He glanced toward the lamps, where their glow was faintly doubled by the mist. "In this city, Watson, truth is like light through glass. It bends before reaching the eye. One must adjust one's angle, or see only distortion." He hailed a cab. "Come, my dear fellow, there is one last visit to make, to Quarles, the lens-maker. The true heart of this mystery may lie not in what was seen, but in what was made to be seen." And thus ended that grim afternoon, with Holmes already one step beyond comprehension, and I, as ever, hurrying in his shadow through the endless fog-drenched labyrinth of London. Chapter 5. The Man Behind the Glass. Sleep eluded me that night. The events of the day, the discovery of Dunwoody in his laboratory, the revelation of that infernal mechanism, the strange light that burned in his solitary eye, replayed themselves endlessly in my mind. I had seen many strange things in Holmes's company, but there was something peculiarly dreadful in this affair. It was not merely a matter of murder, but of a mind warped by its own creation, a crime born of vision itself. When I came down in the morning, the fog still clung to Baker Street like damp wool, but within our familiar sitting room the fire burned brightly. Holmes was at his chemical table, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a pair of spectacles perched precariously upon his hawk-like nose. The table was strewn with mirrors, fragments of glass, and a shallow dish in which some translucent solution fumed faintly. "Good morning, Watson," he said without turning. "I trust you slept soundly." "Soundly enough to dream of mirrors and eyes," I replied, seating myself by the fire. "Lestrade wired this morning. Dunwoody remains in custody, but he raves continually about what lies behind the glass. They fear he may lose his reason altogether." Holmes made no reply. He was holding a glass plate to the light, peering through it with the concentration of a watchmaker. "Holmes," said I at last, "you are not satisfied. I can see it in your face." He smiled faintly. "You are improving in observation, my dear Watson. Indeed, I am not satisfied. Dunwoody's guilt is patent, yet it is not complete. He did not devise the apparatus that killed Penhaligon. He merely used it. The true ingenuity lies elsewhere." "You mean someone else built it?" Holmes nodded. "Last night, after leaving you, I visited the optician Quarles once more. I found the old man locked in his workshop, terrified, poor soul, and with good reason. Someone had been there before me." I started. "A burglary?" "An intrusion," Holmes corrected. The drawers had been rifled, papers scattered, and one of the ledgers gone, the one containing his designs for a series of lenses marked Noctis. That word, Watson, means of the night. It appears our Mr. Penhaligon and his partner were not alone in their experiments." He lifted the plate from the dish and held it over the firelight. A thin film had formed upon its surface, iridescent like oil upon water. "This," said Holmes, "is a reproduction of Penhaligon's glass, or very nearly. Observe how it both reflects and transmits. A man standing before it believes he sees a simple mirror, but if another stands behind, in a darkened chamber, he may look through it as though it were a pane of clear glass." I gasped. "Then Penhaligon's room was no sanctuary at all. He was being watched, Watson. Watched through the very mirror he trusted. For a long moment I could only stare at him. But who could have watched him? Dunwoody?" Holmes shook his head. "Dunwoody is a fool, not a craftsman. He would not have the skill to silver such glass, nor the patience to calibrate it. No, the hand that fashioned these lenses is older, more practiced. It was Quarles himself." "Quarles!" I exclaimed. "But the man is nearly 70. "Age does not dull obsession. He was once a man of reputation, a pioneer in optical chemistry. He spoke to me yesterday of his father's methods with an almost religious reverence. I believe he continued those experiments, in secret and under the pretext of simple craftsmanship. Penhaligon was his pupil, Dunwoody his financier. The tragedy of this case, Watson, is not malice but hubris. Each man saw only what he wished to see, and thus all were blind." He turned from the table and began to pace, his long fingers tapping together. "There is one final proof required, the missing ledger. If it has not been destroyed, it will show the progression from innocent lens-making to espionage." "Espionage? Think of it, Watson. A mirror that allows one to see unseen. Imagine its value to the foreign offices of Europe, or to the baser intrigues of commerce and politics. It would be a tool fit for a king, or a blackmailer." He stopped abruptly and glanced toward the door. "We shall call upon Quarles at once. I fear, however, that we may be too late." The optician's confession. The rain had resumed by the time we reached St. Martin's Lane. The little shop looked even more forlorn than before. The windows were shuttered, the brass telescope dripping with moisture. Holmes knocked twice. There was no reply. He tried the handle. It yielded. The interior was dim, lit only by the pale glow of a shaded lamp at the counter. The air smelled faintly of vinegar and metal. Then from the back room we heard a faint cough. "Mr. Quarles," Holmes called. The old optician emerged slowly from behind the curtain, his spectacles glinting. He looked 10 years older than when we had last seen him. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson." I feared you might come." Holmes advanced gently. "You have been robbed, Mr. Quarles. Your ledger is missing." The man's hands trembled upon the counter. "Yes, gone. Taken last night. They came while I slept. 2 of them. I heard voices in the shop, but when I rose, they fled. Only the broken window remains." Holmes's gaze swept the room and fixed upon a heap of splintered glass near the door. He crouched, examined it, then drew out a small fragment. "Aha! The same iridescent film. And here, Watson, a trace of wax from a candle. They used the same infernal method." Quarles sank into a chair. "I never meant harm. I swear it. My lenses were to serve art and medicine, to help surgeons see, to teach scholars. Then Penhaligon came, with his enthusiasm and his grand designs. He said we could perfect the mirror that both shows and hides. I warned him it was dangerous. He laughed. His voice broke. When he died, I knew it would come to this. You cannot gaze through the world without the world gazing back." Holmes regarded him gravely. "Who came last night, Mr. Quarles?" "I do not know. One was tall, perhaps foreign. The other, I thought for an instant I saw the gleam of a woman's hand." Holmes's head snapped up. "A woman?" "Yes. She wore gloves, but the motion, it was delicate, deliberate. They took the ledger and left in haste. I was too afraid to follow." Holmes straightened. "Watson, we are dealing with something far more intricate than I feared. There is a 4th player in our game." The woman in the carriage. As we stepped into the lane once more, a hansom cab drew up at the corner. Through the misted window we glimpsed a pale face, a woman's, veiled, her gloved hand resting upon the frame. For a fleeting moment Holmes's keen eyes met hers. Then the curtain dropped, the whip cracked, and the carriage vanished into the fog. "Did you see?" I cried. "I did," said Holmes grimly, "and I have no doubt who it was. Mrs. Sloane. Precisely. She has the ledger. She lied to us yesterday when she claimed to have burned the papers. She was not Penhaligon's victim, but his accomplice, and perhaps his betrayer. There are women, Watson, who wield sentiment as a mask for intellect. Mrs. Clara Sloane is of that rare and dangerous breed." We pursued the cab as best we could, but the fog closed around it like a curtain. After several futile turnings, Holmes halted at the edge of Covent Garden, his expression one of icy calculation. "She will not go far," he said at last. "A woman burdened by guilt seeks safety in familiarity. Her rooms in Waterloo Road will be empty, of course, but she has another refuge, the studio where Penhaligon conducted his experiments." "Then we must go there." He shook his head. "Not yet. Darkness will serve us better. The kind of light she needs for her work is the kind that thrives in night. Come, Watson. We shall prepare our own illumination." Night in Lambeth. It was near midnight when we returned to Penhaligon's chambers. The police had sealed the door, but Holmes, with his customary disregard for protocol, produced a slender key of his own devising and admitted us silently. The fire had long gone out. The room was cold, the air heavy with dust and dread. Holmes lit a shaded lamp and set it upon the desk. The broken mirror still hung upon the wall, its fractured surface reflecting our twin images like spectres. "Watson," he whispered, "stand here, and do not move." He crossed to the window, drew the curtain, and extinguished the lamp. Darkness swallowed the room. Then through the silence came the faintest rustle, as of fabric against wood. "There," Holmes murmured, "behind the wall." I strained my ears, and indeed caught a faint creak. Holmes moved like a shadow to the hearth, his hand upon his revolver. Suddenly he thrust aside a hanging coat and pressed upon a panel I had taken for solid plaster. It swung inward soundlessly, revealing a narrow recess, and within it, by the light of a small lantern, stood Mrs. Clara Sloane. Her face was ghastly pale. The missing ledger was clutched against her breast. "Do not move, madam," said Holmes. "The game is finished." For a heartbeat she hesitated. Then her shoulders sagged, and she stepped forward, the light gleaming upon the tears that filled her eyes. "You are too late, Mr. Holmes," she said quietly. He is dead, and what he made dies with him. I have destroyed the formula." "Destroyed it?" Holmes repeated. She nodded. "I burned it tonight before you came. The mirror that sees. It must never exist again. It cost Arthur his life and Edmund his soul." Holmes regarded her with that curious mixture of pity and admiration I had seen him reserve for only the most extraordinary of women. "And you, madam, what did it cost you?" "My heart," she whispered. "For I loved him, though I betrayed him. I thought Dunwoody would spare him if I gave him the secret. Instead, he killed him. I can never atone." For a moment none of us spoke. The fog pressed against the window like a living thing, and the single flame of her lantern flickered across the shards of the mirror, scattering her reflection into 100 trembling ghosts. Holmes took the ledger gently from her hand. "You have done wisely," he said. "There are inventions the world is not fit to possess." Then, turning to me, he added softly, "Fetch Lestrade. Our case, I think, has at last resolved itself, though not perhaps to any man's satisfaction." Epilogue to the chapter. When Lestrade arrived some 20 minutes later, Mrs. Sloane made no resistance. She was taken away quietly, her veil drawn once more across her pale features. Holmes watched from the window until the cab vanished into the mist. "Holmes," I said, "you believe her story?" He sighed. "I believe she told us the truth at last, or as much as any mortal ever does. The ledger's ashes will tell no tales, but her conscience will. As for the mirror, it is broken, and let it remain so." He turned back to the fire, his face half in shadow. "You see, Watson, the danger of such devices lies not in their making, but in the minds of men who would look too closely. The more clearly one sees, the less clearly one understands." I said nothing. Outside, the fog was lifting, and a weak dawn crept over London, pale, uncertain, as though the city itself feared what new reflections it might reveal. Chapter 6. The reflection that would not die. It was several days before the storm surrounding the so-called Lambeth Mirror murder subsided. The newspapers, starved for sensation, devoured every detail that Lestrade and his superiors allowed to slip through their fingers. The Morning Chronicle declared it a crime of scientific sorcery, while the Standard proclaimed Holmes a mystical detective who reads truth in glass. Holmes, of course, ignored all of it. He was deep in one of those silences that rendered him, to all outward appearances, an automaton of thought, moving, eating, even smoking purely by reflex, while his mind roamed elsewhere. I confess the conclusion of the case left me uneasy. Though Mrs. Sloane's confession had cleared many points, there lingered a shadow, a sense of unfinished business. Dunwoody had died suddenly 2 nights after his arrest. Apoplexy, said the jailer. The ledger was gone to ashes. Quarles had shut his shop and left London for the seaside. Yet Holmes was not satisfied. There was something more, some unseen hand behind the mirror's invention that gnawed at him. It was upon the 4th evening after Mrs. Sloane's imprisonment that the matter took its next, and most sinister, turn. A visitor in the night. The fog had returned, that dense, smothering kind that muffles sound and turns the gas lamps to dull moons. Holmes had been playing his violin for an hour, wandering between melancholy and fury in his bowing, when a sudden knock came at our door. Mrs. Hudson, long used to unusual hours and odder visitors, admitted a small, elderly gentleman wrapped in a black cloak. His face was sharp and colourless, his eyes as pale as misted glass. Holmes, who had set down his violin, greeted him with a slight bow. "Mr. Quarles, unless my eyes deceive me." The optician inclined his head. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. Forgive the lateness of my call, but I could not rest until I had spoken with you. I am haunted, sir. Haunted not by what has been done, but by what remains undone." He took the chair Holmes offered and pressed a trembling hand to his brow. "I was not entirely truthful when we last met. There was another set of plans. Not in the ledger Mrs. Sloane burned, but in a separate volume. I hid them. They were my father's designs, upon which all our work was based." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You hid them? Where?" "In Penhaligon's rooms," Quarles whispered. "Behind the mirror. I thought them safe, for who would look there? But the mirror is broken now, and others may suspect." "Others?" Holmes repeated. "You mean Mrs. Sloane's associates?" The old man nodded. "She was not alone in her fascination. There were men, foreign men, who offered gold for our secret. They promised nothing, asked everything. I fear they will not rest now." Holmes rose, pacing the rug with that swift, restless stride I knew too well. "And you come to me tonight because you believe they will seek those plans?" "I do not believe," Quarles said. "I know. For this was left upon my doorstep this morning." He drew from his cloak a scrap of thick white card. Upon it, drawn in ink so black it seemed to absorb the light, was the same symbol we had seen upon Dunwoodie's cufflink, the all-seeing eye surrounded by rays. Beneath it was scrawled a single phrase in an angular foreign hand. "Through glass. We are all watched." Holmes examined it without a word. Then, to my astonishment, he struck a match and burned the card to ash. "Mr. Quarles," he said quietly, "you will spend the night here under my protection. Watson, see to our guest's comfort. I have an engagement." "An engagement?" I cried. "At this hour?" "Precisely because of this hour," he said, drawing on his coat. "The night conceals many watchers, and I intend to see which of them peers through our glass this evening." And before I could utter another word, he was gone into the fog. The shadow at the window. It was near midnight when Holmes returned. His boots and coat were wet through, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "As I suspected," he said, shaking the damp from his hat, "we are not yet rid of our mirror makers." He threw a small parcel upon the table and unwrapped it. Within lay a shard of glass, smooth on one side, silvered on the other, its edge cut with extraordinary precision. "This," he said, "I found at the rear window of Penhaligon's lodgings. Someone has been there tonight." I glanced at Quarles, who had dozed uneasily by the fire. The old man stirred, muttering, "They will not stop. They will not stop until the lens is made anew." "Who are they, Mr. Quarles?" I pressed gently. He lifted his head with a strange, feverish gleam in his eyes. "A society. I do not know its name. They came first as patrons, collectors of rare optical instruments. They spoke of art, of science, but their questions were not those of artists. They wanted to see without being seen. When I refused, they turned to Penhaligon. And now they have the glass." Holmes nodded slowly. "The symbol, the radiant eye, suggests a cult of vision. It has appeared before, Watson. The Ordo Speculorum, a cabal obsessed with the notion that every truth in the world is hidden in reflection. I encountered its traces once in Paris. The society was thought dissolved years ago." "You think they have returned?" "I think they never left." He turned to Quarles. "We must reach those papers before they do. Will you accompany us?" The old man hesitated, then rose shakily to his feet. "Yes. Better they perish by my hand than fall into theirs." The return to Lambeth. Once more we made our way through the labyrinthine fog to Lambeth. Holmes moved with the swiftness of a hound on scent, pausing only once to consult a small compass he drew from his pocket. "Southwest wind," he murmured. "They will have come by the river." The house where Penhaligon had lived loomed from the mist like a tomb. Its windows were dark, save for a faint flicker in the upper chamber. Holmes extinguished his lantern and motioned for silence. We ascended the stair in darkness, each board seeming to creak like a whisper of warning. At the landing he paused, crouching low. A thin line of light showed beneath the door, the same door that had once concealed the body. A shadow moved across it. Holmes leaned close to my ear. One man, possibly two, armed. He drew his revolver, then pushed the door open with a sudden thrust. The scene within froze in a single instant of dreadful clarity. Two men stood by the broken mirror, the shards of which had been removed from the wall and laid carefully upon the desk. One was tall and broad-shouldered, the other slight and wearing a dark cloak. At the sight of us, the smaller man cried out and reached for something within his coat. Holmes's pistol barked once, and the object, a small vial of clear liquid, shattered upon the floor, releasing a pungent metallic odor. "Hold, gentlemen," Holmes commanded. "You will find the exits rather inconveniently watched." The taller of the two men sneered in a foreign accent. "You meddle in matters beyond your understanding, Mr. Holmes. The mirror belongs to those who can use it." "Indeed," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "And yet you handle it with the delicacy of a thief rifling a dead man's pockets." The man lunged suddenly, but Holmes was quicker. In an instant he had seized the intruder by the wrist and sent him sprawling. Lestrade, who, it transpired, had followed us on Holmes's invitation, burst through the door with 2 constables. In moments the pair were secured. As the light of the constables' lanterns filled the room, Quarles crept forward, his eyes fixed upon the shattered fragments with something between reverence and horror. "So much beauty," he murmured, "and so much evil." Holmes knelt beside the desk, his gaze sweeping the wreckage. "Here, Watson, the hiding place." He pried loose a small wooden panel behind the mirror's frame, revealing a narrow compartment. Within lay a thin sheaf of papers, yellowed and fragile. He handed them silently to Quarles. The old man's hands shook. "The last of my father's work," he whispered. "It must end here." Holmes nodded solemnly. "And it shall. Lestrade, see that these men are removed. I shall attend to the rest." When the police had gone, Quarles gathered the papers, fed them one by one into the fire, and watched as the flames consumed them. The light danced across his face, illuminating eyes that seemed both relieved and sorrowful. When the last page had turned to ash, he rose slowly. "Now it is done," he said. "No more eyes behind glass." Holmes placed a hand upon his shoulder. "Let us hope so." The eye that remained. We left the house as dawn began to creep through the fog. The river shimmered faintly, like molten lead. Holmes walked in silence, his hat pulled low, the ghost of fatigue upon his features. At length I said, "You have destroyed the invention. The case is over." "Over?" He gave a short laugh. "Nothing in this world, my dear Watson, is ever truly over. Destroy the glass, and another will learn to polish it anew. The human appetite for unseen knowledge is infinite." He paused upon Westminster Bridge and gazed down at the sluggish Thames. "Still, we have bought the world a little blindness. And sometimes," he added softly, "it is better not to see." I followed his gaze, and for a moment I thought I saw, far below in the slow grey current, a faint glimmer, as if a single shard of mirror drifted just beneath the surface, catching the first light of dawn. When I turned to point it out, Holmes had already moved on. Chapter 7. The Eyes of the Dead. I must beg my reader's indulgence if in recounting this final and most dreadful phase of the glass-eyed affair, my pen falters, and my recollection grows uncertain. There are cases, even in the career of so singular a man as Sherlock Holmes, where the boundary between logic and terror becomes so fine that one wonders, in later years, whether it was truly crossed at all. The events that followed our encounter in Lambeth left me with that impression, that we had stood upon the very threshold of something unseen, something that watched us, and which might yet be watching still. The Restless Dead. It was 3 nights after the capture of the so-called mirror thieves that the first of the strange occurrences began. Holmes had gone out late, as was his habit, leaving me to doze before the fire with a medical journal. I had just laid it aside when a sharp rapping came at the window. Thinking it some vagrant or drunken cabman, I rose irritably, but when I drew back the curtain I saw no one. Only the faint reflection of my own face stared back from the glass. Then, and I confess my hand trembles even now as I write it, that reflection moved. For an instant I was certain that the image blinked. I recoiled, blinking myself, and the illusion vanished. There was only the fog beyond the pane and the faint lamplight of Baker Street. But even as I tried to laugh at my own nerves, The sound of a key turned softly in the lock behind me. Holmes entered, hat and coat glistening with moisture, and stopped short when he saw my expression. "My dear fellow," he said mildly, "you look as though you had seen a ghost." "Perhaps I have," I said, forcing a smile. "At least my own. This fog plays tricks on the nerves." Holmes removed his gloves slowly, his eyes upon me. "The fog," he said, "or something that watches through it?" I stared. "You cannot mean—" He raised a hand. "I mean that we are not yet done with this matter, Watson. The thieves taken in Lambeth were mere agents, the lesser mirrors, if you will, reflecting the design of a greater mind. Something remains. Something." Holmes seated himself by the fire, the flame casting angular shadows upon his lean features. "2 nights ago, the bodies of our prisoners were found in their cells, dead. No wound, no sign of struggle. The jailer swears the door was locked from within. Their faces were contorted as though they had died in terror, and each had one eye, the right, filmed over with an unnatural glaze. The coroner could find no cause." "My God," I whispered. "Lestrade is convinced it is coincidence. I am not. I have seen this before, in the archives of Paris, in connection with the same accursed emblem. The all-seeing eye, the Ordo Speculorum Watson, has re-emerged. The relic of Penhaligon." Before I could frame a reply, Holmes rose abruptly and went to his desk. He drew open a drawer and produced a small, velvet-lined box. Within it lay the fragment of mirror he had recovered from Lambeth, now cleaned and mounted in a thin brass frame. "I kept this," he said, "against my better judgment. I wished to study its structure. Observe." He held it up to the lamplight, angling it slightly. The glass was faintly iridescent, its surface shimmering like the skin of a bubble. At a certain angle one could see through it. At another, it reflected perfectly. Holmes turned it slowly in his hand. "A triumph of optics," he murmured, "and a curse of the spirit. The same combination of reflection and refraction that enables this glass to reveal both sides also creates a phenomenon I can scarcely account for. A secondary image, faint but persistent, that forms even when no light source exists." He lowered the mirror and looked at me keenly. "Do you see it, Watson?" I leaned forward. For an instant, only an instant, I thought I did. A faint shadow, a suggestion of a human outline behind my own reflection. Then it was gone. "It is some optical illusion," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Holmes said softly. "And yet if illusion, why has it appeared in rooms far from here?" Quarles himself swore that the same image haunted his shop before he fled to Brighton. He described it. A tall man, one eye gleaming as if made of glass. A chill crept up my spine. "You think—" "I think," Holmes interrupted, "that Penhaligon's invention in its destruction has birthed something that cannot easily be buried. The glass may be shattered, but the image remains. The eyes of the dead, Watson, do not close so easily." The visit to the morgue. The following day we were summoned to St. Thomas's Hospital, where the bodies of the 2 dead thieves lay. The coroner, a brisk young man named Dr. Bellamy, greeted us with relief. "I am glad you're here, Mr. Holmes," he said. "The matter is beyond ordinary medicine. Look for yourself." He led us to the cold chamber. The corpses lay side by side beneath white sheets. When the cloth was drawn back, I started involuntarily. The faces were pale as wax, the mouths contorted in silent cries, but it was the eyes, or rather the single eye of each, that froze my blood. The right orb was clouded over with a milky film, yet beneath that film there glimmered faintly what seemed to be silver, as though a mirror lay within the flesh itself. Holmes bent close, his expression grave. "Have you examined the vitreous humor?" "Yes," said Bellamy. "Perfectly clear, but the cornea appears to have been silvered from within. No known chemical could produce such an effect." Holmes straightened slowly. "Unless," he said, "it was produced not by a chemical, but by an idea." The coroner blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Forgive me," said Holmes. You deal in the tangible, Doctor. I sometimes must deal in the reflected. These men died of fear, but not ordinary fear. They looked upon something no man should see. He turned to me. Watson, you recall how Penhaligon stared at his mirror in those final hours. What if the glass reflected more than image? What if it reflected conscience itself? To one steeped in guilt, such a reflection might be intolerable. You speak as though the mirror were alive. Holmes's lips thinned. Perhaps it is, in the sense that fire is alive, or a contagion. It feeds upon those who feed it. Remember the motto on Dunwoodie's cufflink. He sees through glass what others cannot. The Ordo Speculorum believed that in reflection lies the true soul. They sought to make the mirror see back. The final reflection. That night Holmes worked without pause. The mirror fragment lay upon the table, surrounded by his retorts and lenses. I watched in silence, though unease gnawed at me. At last, near 3 a.m, he straightened with a sigh. "I have reached a conclusion," he said. "It is neither scientific nor sane, but it is the only one that fits the facts." He gestured to the glass. "This fragment retains within it a residual image, a kind of optical echo. When the eye of a man falls upon it, the reflection lingers, infinitesimally imprinted upon the surface. Enough of these imprints, superimposed, and one might produce an apparition, not of the living, but of those who have looked before." I stared at him in horror. "Then—" "Yes," Holmes said quietly. "We are all in some measure recorded by our reflections. The mirror remembers." He lifted the shard, turned it to the firelight, and for the briefest instant I saw, or thought I saw, another face beside his own. The gaunt, glass-eyed visage of Edmund Dunwoodie, smiling faintly through the shimmer. Holmes hurled the fragment into the fire. It cracked, hissed, and was gone. "There," he said, "the last of it. Now perhaps London may sleep unobserved once more." He sank into his chair, exhaustion written upon every line of him. I could find no words. Outside, the fog rolled past the window like smoke from the pyre of some ancient offering. When at last I turned to bid him good night, I saw that the polished surface of his violin case, standing beside the hearth, still caught the firelight, and in its reflection, for just an instant, 2 figures sat where only one should have been. Chapter 8. The Man in the Mirror. The dawn that followed was one of those wan London mornings that seems to creep rather than rise, the light pale and reluctant, the very air fatigued with its own greyness. Holmes had not slept. I found him still seated by the fire when I rose, the remnants of tobacco ash scattered across the hearthrug like the residue of some secret rite. He greeted me with a brief nod, his eyes heavy but burning with that inward fire I knew so well. "Watson," he said, "you may congratulate yourself upon surviving the night." "Surviving?" I echoed. "My dear Holmes, surely the peril has passed. The glass is destroyed, the thieves are dead, Mrs. Sloane and Quarles are safe. What danger remains?" Holmes smiled faintly, a smile with no mirth in it. "The same danger that faces every man who looks too long into his own reflection. The peril of seeing not what is, but what waits behind it." He rose abruptly, went to the window, and flung it open. The cold air swept into the room, driving out the lingering smoke. "I have been considering, Watson, why this case should trouble me more than any other. The facts are clear, the culprits accounted for. Yet the mind recoils, as if some unfinished question remains. And what question is that? Whose eye first looked through the glass?" He turned to me then, and I saw that exhaustion had deepened the lines of his face. "I tell you in confidence, my dear fellow, there was a moment last night when I doubted the evidence of my own senses. When I hurled that fragment into the fire, I saw, unmistakably saw, another face reflected beside my own. Not Dunwoodie's, as you claim to have seen, but one older, colder, and infinitely more knowing. "Holmes," I cried, "you have been too long without rest. These fancies—" "Perhaps." He cut me off gently. "Yet fancies, Watson, have an awkward habit of becoming facts when one follows them far enough." A call from Scotland Yard. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a telegram. Holmes tore it open, scanned it, and passed it silently across the table. It was from Lestrade. Quarles found dead at Brighton. Circumstances identical to Lambeth thieves. Eye discolored. Request your presence immediately. I read the words twice before I could speak. Holmes, this is monstrous. You saw the man yourself, frail, terrified, incapable of harm. Yet harm has found him, said Holmes grimly, and it moves with method. Come, Watson, there will be a train within the hour. The death at Brighton. By noon we were standing in a small lodging-house near the Brighton seafront. The sea mist had crept inland, giving the narrow rooms an air of ghostly damp. Quarles lay upon his bed, his face peaceful, too peaceful, save for the same terrible mark, the right eye filmed with that unnatural silver sheen. Holmes examined him closely, saying nothing. The local inspector, a florid man with an unfortunate moustache, watched with evident discomfort. "No sign of struggle, sir," he said. "Door locked from inside, window fastened, fire burnt low as if he'd sat here half the night. There's a looking-glass on the wall. Thought nothing of it, but you may wish to see." We followed him to the opposite side of the room. A small mirror hung above the washstand, its surface faintly clouded with age. Holmes leaned close and froze. There, visible even to my untrained eye, was a pale impression, as though the ghost of a handprint lingered upon the glass. He breathed out slowly. He was not alone when he died. Someone or something stood behind him. The inspector snorted. "Begging your pardon, sir, but there's no sign anyone entered." Holmes did not reply. He drew from his pocket a small magnifying lens and began to examine the surface of the mirror inch by inch. At last he straightened, his expression unreadable. "It is not residue, Watson. It is etched into the glass itself, a perfect outline of a human hand. Heat, perhaps, or light." "Then someone used an instrument, or an eye," Holmes murmured. "An eye that sees through glass and leaves its mark behind." The House by the Sea. That evening we dined in silence at a small inn overlooking the shingle. Holmes ate little, his gaze fixed upon the dark horizon where sea and sky merged into one unbroken void. At last he spoke. "Watson, do you recall Mrs. Sloane's confession? She claimed to have destroyed the formula, yet if these deaths continue, the formula must have survived, or the principle has escaped destruction. Ideas like contagions seldom die cleanly. You believe someone continues Penhaligon's work? I believe the work continues itself." I stared at him in alarm. "Holmes, you speak in riddles." He gave a weary smile. "Then let me be plain. The mirror remembers, as I told you, but perhaps it also teaches. What if, once exposed to the principle of its design, a man's very vision becomes the instrument? What if the eye, human or glass, becomes the conduit of reflection?" He paused, and for a long moment the only sound was the steady hiss of the tide. "You mean—" "I mean," said Holmes quietly, "that whoever looks too long into that kind of mirror may carry its power thereafter. They become, in effect, a walking lens, seeing through glass, as the motto proclaimed. Quarles, Dunwoody, perhaps even Penhaligon, and now, perhaps, another." His gaze drifted toward the window pane beside us, where our reflections sat in spectral outline against the dark. "There is still one man unaccounted for," he said. "The tall foreigner, the one Quarles glimpsed in his shop. I believe he has followed the experiment from its birth, and means now to complete it." The man in the mirror. It was close to midnight when the door of our chamber creaked open. A gust of cold air swept through, extinguishing the lamp. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Who's there?" he demanded. A low voice answered from the darkness. "One who has seen too much. Mr. Holmes." The match flared in Holmes's hand, casting its frail circle of light. And there, framed in the doorway, stood a tall man in a dark traveling coat, his features obscured by shadow save for one gleaming eye. A glass eye, glimmering with a faint inner light. "Dunwoody!" I gasped. The stranger smiled, a cold, mirthless smile. Dunwoody is dead. I am what he saw. Holmes did not move. You have been following us since Lambeth, he said. You killed Quarles. The man inclined his head slightly. He freed me, as you soon shall. He stepped forward, and as he did, the lamplight caught his eye full on. It glowed, not merely reflected, but emitted light like a miniature sun. The room was filled with its pallid shimmer, and for an instant I thought I saw, within that gleam, 100 faces, Penhaligons, Dunwoodies, even my own, saw whirling like trapped souls in a silver vortex. Holmes seized the poker from the hearth. "Watson! The lamp!" I swung it upward, shattering the chimney glass. Flame leapt. The intruder recoiled with a hiss like steam. In that moment Holmes struck, the poker descending in a single terrible arc. There was a crash, not of bone but of shattering glass. The man, or what remained of him, collapsed to the floor. His right eye had burst, scattering fragments that smoked faintly where they fell. When the fumes cleared, only an empty socket stared upward, and the faintest reflection of our two faces shimmered upon the fragment nearest the fire. Holmes knelt, his voice low and strained. "So ends the man behind the mirror." I was too shaken to reply. The fragment seemed to pulse with an inner light before fading into darkness. Aftermath. We buried what remained of the intruder with the local authorities' consent. There was no name to give him, no country to claim him. Lestrade's telegram the next day merely read, "Case closed." No further incidents reported. Holmes, however, did not treat it as closed. For days he wandered the sitting room like a man pursued by invisible reflections, the curtains drawn and every mirror in the house covered. At last he spoke. "The experiment has ended," he said, "but the principle remains. You cannot unsee what has once been seen, Watson. The danger is not in the glass, but in the mind that looks through it." He paused, and I noticed with a sudden chill that his eyes seemed darker than usual, as though shadowed from within. "Still," he added with a faint attempt at levity, "we may safely say that for once Inspector Lestrade is looking into matters no further, and that, my dear fellow, is a mercy." He turned away then to stare into the fire, and in its trembling light I could not help but imagine that somewhere deep within those sharp grey eyes there flickered a glint of silver, like the dying echo of a reflection that refused to fade. Chapter 9. The Shadow Beyond. Baker Street. In all my long association with Sherlock Holmes, I can recall but few occasions when he betrayed even the faintest sign of fear. Yet in those days which followed our return from Brighton, I saw a change in him that I could not mistake. He had become restless, irritable, and prone to sudden silences, the sort of haunted introspection I had observed once before, after the case of the Devil's Foot. The fog had lifted from London, leaving behind that raw, colourless air peculiar to early winter. Our sitting-room, however, seemed perpetually dim. Holmes had ordered every mirror covered, from the mantelpiece to the small shaving-glass in his bedroom, with sheets of black cloth. The effect was funereal, and it seemed to me that Baker Street had itself become a mausoleum of reflections. For my own part, I tried to bring some sense of normalcy to our existence. The morning papers, a pot of tea, a few words about a patient or the progress of my notes. But Holmes barely listened. He spent long hours at his microscope or bending over small fragments of glass which, though I swore I had seen him destroy, seemed to multiply upon his desk like cursed seeds. The letter without a seal. It was on the morning of the 21st of November, a date I remember with singular clarity, that a letter arrived without postmark or seal. Mrs. Hudson, pale and trembling, brought it in herself. "Beg pardon, Doctor," she said, "but the man who handed this over, well, he was standing right outside the door, and when I turned round again he was gone. Vanished, sir." Holmes took the envelope without a word. The paper was fine and faintly perfumed, the handwriting a narrow, elegant script that leaned slightly to the left. He broke it open and read aloud, "Mr. Holmes, you have looked too far and seen too much. The glass is never empty. Return what was taken, or the reflection will claim its due. There was no signature, only a small symbol at the bottom of the page. The all-seeing eye. Holmes studied it for a long moment. "So?" he said softly. "The Ordo Speculorum is not yet content." I leaned forward. "You think this a threat?" "I think it an invitation," he replied, folding the letter. "Watson, the time has come to meet our watcher's face. To face. A journey by night." By that evening we were in a hansom rattling eastward through the warren of streets beyond the Strand. Holmes had received a second communication, a brief note delivered by Boy, instructing him to come alone to the disused glassworks at Limehouse before midnight. "You mean to walk into their trap?" I asked as the cab jolted through the fog. "I mean to look through it," he said, with that grim play upon words which so often prefaced his most dangerous ventures. "If we are to end this business, we must see who stands behind the mirror, in every sense." We reached Limehouse shortly before midnight. The glassworks was a ruin, a gaunt skeleton of brick and iron, its windows broken, its interior lit only by the faint phosphorescence of the Thames beyond. A rusted sign creaked in the wind. Holmes dismounted lightly, motioning for silence. "Keep close, Watson. No light until I give the word." We crept through the shattered doorway. The air within was thick with dust and the acrid scent of chemicals long stale. Then, as our eyes adjusted, we saw that the central floor had been cleared, swept of debris, and upon it stood a single table. Upon that table, lit by a single lamp, was a great mirror. It was no ordinary glass. Its surface shimmered faintly as though it breathed. The circle of eyes. A voice spoke from the shadows. "You are punctual, Mr. Holmes." From the darkness beyond the lamp emerged 5 figures, all cloaked, their faces obscured by veils of gauze. Each wore upon the breast a small medallion bearing the emblem of the radiant eye. They moved with the slow precision of ritual. Holmes stood motionless. "You honor me," he said coldly. "The Ordo Speculorum, I presume." "The order needs no name," said the foremost figure, a man of commanding height whose voice carried the trace of an Eastern accent. "You have trespassed upon our domain, Mr. Holmes. The knowledge you destroyed was not yours to extinguish." "The knowledge," Holmes returned, "was poison. It killed Penhaligon, destroyed Dunwoody, and now haunts even your disciples. What use is a mirror that devours its makers?" The man laughed softly. "You speak as one who has already seen. Do you deny, then, that you felt the gaze? That you carry it now?" Holmes's hand twitched, and for the first time I saw uncertainty flicker in his eyes. "I deny nothing," he said quietly. The leader gestured toward the great mirror. "Then look again, detective. The reflection accepts no denial." The others stepped aside. The mirror's surface seemed to pulse, the light deepening until it resembled a pool of black water. Holmes advanced a pace. "Stay back," I whispered, catching his arm. He shook me off gently. "If truth is there, Watson, I must see it. The mirror's secret." He leaned forward, gazing into the glass. For a long moment nothing happened. Then I saw, or thought I saw, his reflection shift. It no longer matched his movements. When he raised his hand, the image lagged. When he stepped forward, it smiled. A grim, knowing smile that Holmes himself did not wear. Holmes recoiled sharply, color draining from his face. "Do you see?" the leader said. "It is not a reflection. It is memory. The glass remembers every eye that has ever looked into it. Dunwoody, Penhaligon, Quarles, Crewe, and now you." Holmes drew himself up, mastering his fear. "Then it remembers also the folly of men who sought to see too much. I see only a gallery of ghosts, and the living fools who join them." In one swift motion he seized the lamp from the table and hurled it against the mirror. There was an explosion of flame and glass, a scream from the robed figures, and a blinding white flash that seared my vision. When my sight returned, the chamber was a chaos of smoke and fire. The mirror lay shattered, its fragments glimmering like embers. The figures of the order had vanished. Only Holmes remained standing before the wreckage, his face lit by the dying glow. "It's finished," he said hoarsely. "They are gone." But even as he spoke, a faint light pulsed within the largest fragment at his feet. Not the reflection of the flames, but something deeper, colder, alive. He bent toward it, and I saw, reflected there, not his face, but mine. I caught his arm. "Come, Holmes. The place will collapse." He started as if waking from a trance, and together we fled into the night as the timbers groaned and fell behind us. The shadow returns to Baker Street. By dawn, the fire had consumed what remained of the glassworks. The police called it an accident, though the constables who found us wandering the embankment at first light swore that the river itself shimmered with reflections long after the flames had died. We returned to Baker Street exhausted and grimy. Holmes said little. He ordered every mirror in the flat to remain covered, and for the rest of that day he sat before the fire, his eyes half closed, a strange light flickering in their depths. Once I thought I heard him murmur, almost to himself, "The glass remembers, but does it also dream?" I said nothing, for in the polished lid of his violin case, though every mirror in the room lay veiled, I fancied I saw again that faint, impossible shimmer, as though even in our refuge something unseen still watched from the other side of the glass. Chapter 8. The Dreaming Glass. For several days following our return from Limehouse, Holmes's condition caused me grave concern. His energy, once inexhaustible, seemed to ebb away as though drawn from him by invisible threads. He spent long hours sitting motionless before the fire, his violin untouched, the ashes of his pipe collecting in grey drifts about the hearth. At times I caught him gazing at the covered mirrors with a curious intensity, as if, even through their shrouds, they might yet return his stare. The papers of Kurz were full of the Limehouse conflagration. "Mysterious fire in disused glassworks," proclaimed the Chronicle. "Secret society suspected." There were rumors of bodies found in the ruins, though no official report confirmed it. Lestrade, in one of his rare visits, declared the matter closed. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," was his verdict. "The Yard's happy to let that lot burn themselves out." But Holmes was not content. He kept the blinds drawn day and night, as though the faintest reflection might betray him. The Midnight Disturbance. It was near midnight when I was roused from uneasy sleep by a sound from the sitting room, a faint metallic note like the vibration of a tuning fork. I rose, threw on my dressing gown, and stepped quietly to the door. Holmes sat before the fire, but the fire had long since burned to embers. The sound came from the corner where his violin lay, its strings trembling as though plucked by invisible fingers. "Holmes," I began. "What on earth—" He lifted a hand sharply. "Listen." The note deepened, resonating through the room. Then unmistakably a faint whisper seemed to rise from the air itself. Not speech, but something like breath drawn across glass. It grew louder until the covered mirrors quivered in their frames. "Holmes," I exclaimed, "what is this?" His face was pale, his voice calm. "It is the echo, Watson. The memory that remains. The mirror may be broken, but it dreams still." As he spoke, one of the black coverings stirred, as if by a passing draught. A corner fell away, and for an instant the polished surface beneath caught the firelight. And something else. I saw reflected there the faint image of Holmes, but not the Holmes who sat beside me. This reflection was smiling. With a swift movement, Holmes seized the cloth and flung it back over the glass. The sound ceased at once. "You see?" he said quietly. "It is not only memory that persists. Reflection itself is contagious." He sank into his chair, his hands pressed to his temples. "They called it the dreaming glass. Watson, Penhaligon's final term for the perfected lens. He meant it to capture not image but consciousness. When one looked into it, it did not merely record, It mirrored the mind. That is why those men died as they did. Their own thoughts turned upon them. I stared at him in horror. And you looked into it too. He gave a faint smile. Yes. And since that night I have not dreamed as other men do. When I close my eyes, I see faces, fragments, 1,000 flickering memories that are not my own. I have become, as it were, a part of the mirror. Holmes's experiment. The next morning he announced with the calm precision of a man describing a surgical operation that he intended to repeat the experiment. It is the only way, Watson. I must know whether the effect resides in the glass or in the observer. If in the former it is destroyed. If in the latter, I interrupted hotly, you risk your reason. He regarded me kindly. My dear fellow, you exaggerate. A little risk sharpens the wits. Fetch me the silver nitrate from my reagent shelf. Reluctantly I obeyed. Holmes set to work with steady hands, coating a fragment of ordinary glass with the solution. He placed it before the fire until the surface took on a faint shimmer. Then, positioning his chair opposite, he sat down and stared into it. For 10 minutes he did not move. Then slowly he began to speak. I see. The river, he murmured. Fog upon the water, and faces beneath the surface. Penhaligon, Dunwoody, they are calling. His voice faltered. No, not calling. Watching. He rose abruptly, his face ghastly pale, and dashed the glass to the floor. Enough, he cried. The vision is not in the glass, it is in the mind. They have built a mirror inside me. The physician's dilemma. For 2 days thereafter, Holmes neither ate nor slept. I grew desperate. At last, fearing for his sanity, I sent a note to his brother Mycroft, imploring him to intervene. But before any reply could arrive, the crisis came. It was on the 3rd night. The wind moaned about the chimneys, and the city lay steeped in darkness. I had dozed in my chair when a sound woke me, the slow, deliberate lifting of a cloth. I sprang up. Holmes stood before the mantel, one of the veiled mirrors uncovered. His reflection gazed back, not as a copy, but as a presence distinct, independent. Holmes, I shouted. He did not turn. Do you not see, Watson? He is waiting. The reflection, the one who looked back in Limehouse. He was never destroyed. Step away from it, I cried, rushing forward. But even as I reached him, the mirror's surface rippled. The reflected Holmes smiled, that same cold, knowing smile I had glimpsed before, and extended a hand. Holmes recoiled, his eyes wide with horror. The glass shimmered like liquid. I seized the poker and struck the mirror full force. It shattered, the fragments falling like rain. For a heartbeat, silence. Then Holmes collapsed into my arms. The awakening. He awoke the next morning weak but lucid. Watson, he said faintly, you have once again saved me from my own folly. The reflection. It was my own mind staring back, magnified and distorted by obsession. The true danger was not in Penhaligon's invention, but in the temptation it offered, to see beyond what nature allows. He smiled, wanly but genuinely. Burn the fragments, everyone. Let there be no more dreaming glass in this world. I obeyed. The shards turned black in the flame, curling like paper, until nothing remained. Epilogue. The Mirror's Dream. Weeks passed. Holmes recovered his vigor, and our life resumed its accustomed rhythm. Yet there were moments, fleeting, subtle, when I caught in his eyes a strange reflective glint, as if the light itself paused there before passing on. One evening, as he tuned his violin, I ventured to ask whether he had truly been free of visions since that night. He smiled. Entirely, my dear Watson. Though, he added lightly, I sometimes fancy that when I play, the notes echo more sweetly than before, as if the sound remembers itself. He lifted the bow. The first notes filled the room, low, resonant, haunting. I sat back, content, until I noticed, quite by chance, that the polished curve of the violin's body caught the firelight, and in that fleeting reflection I thought I saw two faces, mine and his. But the second smiled, and then it was gone. Chapter divined. The music of reflections. It was in the bleak closing days of November when that final phase of the glass-eyed affair unfolded, a chapter which, though less violent than those that preceded it, chilled me more deeply than any I had yet known. For it was not the physical danger that now threatened us, but something subtler, older, and infinitely more insidious, the slow encroachment of the unseen upon the living mind. Holmes had recovered in body. He walked again with his characteristic energy, and from the casual observer's point of view, he was much his usual self. Lean, keen, and untiring. He resumed his correspondence, his experiments, and even took a minor case concerning a stolen snuff-box, which he solved in an afternoon merely to prove to Lestrade that he could. And yet to me, who had come to read the smallest flicker of his expression as plainly as I might a line of print, there was a difference. His laughter came less readily, his silences lasted longer. Often when I entered the room unexpectedly, I would find him standing quite still, gazing not at anything in particular, but at the air itself, as though the world before him were not quite real, or as though he were listening to something inaudible. The violin's whisper. It was on one of those dark, still evenings, when London lay wrapped in fog and the lamps glowed like blurred halos, that I first heard what I can only call the whisper in the strings. Holmes had taken up his violin after supper, more, I think, from habit than inclination, and began to play a soft, meandering air. The notes drifted languidly at first, the sort of half-conscious improvisation he sometimes indulged in while thinking. I was writing at my desk when I noticed a faint tremor in the sound, a strange undertone that did not seem to belong to the melody. I looked up. Holmes was playing with eyes half closed, his face illuminated by the firelight, the bow moving with delicate precision. But beneath the violin's singing voice there came another tone, lower, slower, like an echo following the main theme by a fraction of a beat. I rose quietly, thinking some peculiarity of acoustics was at work. But as I crossed the carpet, I realized that the echo came not from the room, but from the violin itself. Each note Holmes played seemed to answer itself. He stopped abruptly, lowering the bow. "You heard it too, Watson." "I did," I said. "But what was it?" Holmes stared at the instrument in his hands. "I do not know. It began a week ago when I restrung the bridge. A resonance beyond the fundamental. Curious, is it not?" He set the violin aside. "No matter. We will speak no more of it tonight." But I knew from the tension in his voice that he would speak of little else again. The return of the reflection. The next morning I found him hunched over his microscope. Upon the stage lay what appeared to be a wood shaving no larger than a thumbnail. "From the violin," he said without looking up. "A sliver from the inner surface. Look, Watson." I bent to the eyepiece and saw, impossibly, a sheen across the grain, faint and silvery, like mercury threaded through the wood. "Surely that is some residue from your chemical tests." He shook his head. "No. The violin has not left this room since it was repaired. Do you remember, Watson, what I told you of Penhaligon's final formula? The so-called dreaming glass. He sought to create not reflection, but remembrance. What if, by some whim of fate, a trace of that principle survived in this house, and settled upon the varnish, the very surface of the violin? I could find no reply. He smiled thinly. "You recall, of course, the last words I spoke to you before I collapsed. The mirror dreams. I thought then it was my imagination. Now I wonder whether it was, in fact, a statement of fact. For what is music, Watson, but the sound of air reflecting upon itself? Perhaps this instrument has learned to remember its own song." He rose and began to pace. "If so, we may have stumbled upon something even Penhaligon never conceived. A mirror not of sight, but of sound. an echo that endures beyond the moment of its making. The experiment. Despite my protestations, Holmes resolved to investigate the phenomenon that same evening. He arranged the room with scientific precision, curtains drawn, lamps shaded, instruments at the ready. "I shall play," he said, "a simple arpeggio. You, my dear Watson, will record what you hear, and if when I cease the music continues, we shall have proof." He began to play. The melody was spare, haunting, almost mournful, her rising and falling pattern like a breath. I noted the time carefully. The air was utterly still. Then, as the final note hung trembling, he lowered the bow. Silence. And then, softly, impossibly, the phrase repeated itself. Not upon the strings, for Holmes's hands were still. Not from any echo, for the curtains were drawn. It came from somewhere deeper, as though the very air remembered. Holmes's face lit with grim triumph. "You hear it?" "I hear something," I whispered. "Then it is true. The resonance of the dreaming glass persists. It has imprinted itself upon matter, upon sound." His voice broke with a strange mixture of awe and dread. "Do you not see, Watson? This is what Penhaligon sought, to make memory physical, every tone, every thought preserved." The sound faded, and Holmes lowered the violin to his side. "We must end this," he said quietly, "before it learns to play without me." A visitor from the yard. The next day brought Lestrade. He entered briskly, rubbing his hands. "I trust you're done with that cursed mirror business, Mr. Holmes. The yard's washing its hands of it." Holmes inclined his head. "Then the yard shows more wisdom than I, Inspector, for the case is not yet finished." Lestrade gave a short laugh. "Then you'll finish it alone. I've no taste for ghosts in looking-glasses." As he left, Holmes watched him go with a peculiar expression, part amusement, part pity. There goes the last man in London who still believes reality is confined to what he can arrest. That evening he played again, softly as though in defiance. The violin's tone was pure and steady, until the final chord, when once more the echo came. But this time it did not fade. It grew. The melody rose of its own accord, swelling in perfect imitation of his playing. The bow slipped from Holmes's fingers. The violin continued. He backed away slowly, eyes wide. "Watson, it remembers." The burning of the violin. I seized the instrument, meaning to silence it. The instant my hand touched the wood, a shock ran through me, a vibration not of sound, but of thought. I saw, as in a flash, images. The fog of Lambeth, Penhaligon's terrified face, Dunwoodie's gleaming eye, the shattered mirror. The air itself seemed alive with memory. Holmes snatched it from me and thrust it into the fire. The flames caught at once, leaping blue, then white. A strange sweetness filled the room, like burning resin. When it was done, nothing remained but a handful of blackened strings, and a smell faintly of ozone. Holmes sank into his chair, trembling. "It is finished," he said hoarsely. "The last reflection has been silenced." Coda London awoke the next morning to a sky of pale gold. Holmes, after a long sleep, was himself again, quiet, rational, though infinitely weary. "There are two kinds of mirrors, Watson," he said as we breakfasted. "Those that show the world as it is, and those that show the world as it remembers itself. We have looked into both, and been lucky to escape with our eyes unclouded." He stirred his tea thoughtfully. "There will be others, of course. Men who think they can capture memory or conscience or life itself in glass or sound or color. But they will learn, as Penhaligon did, that the truest reflection lies not in what is seen or heard, but in what is forgotten." He smiled then, a true smile, warm and human. "Now, my dear fellow, I believe I shall take a holiday. There is, I am told, excellent trout fishing in Hampshire. Let the glass dream without us." And so ended the case of the glass-eyed man. Not with the report of a pistol or the rattle of a hansom in pursuit, but with the quiet crackle of a fire, and the faint echo of a violin that would play no more. Chapter 20. The Mirror in the Mind. It was a week or more after the burning of Holmes's violin that I began to hope, in earnest, that the affair of the glass-eyed man had at last been laid to rest. London itself seemed to breathe easier. The fogs that had so long haunted our footsteps lifted. A rare, fragile winter sunlight crept across Baker Street, and Holmes, though pale and thinner than I liked, resumed his customary rhythm of study and indolence, alternating between furious activity and long brooding stretches of silence before the fire. He never again spoke of mirrors, nor of sound that remembered itself, but at times, when the afternoon light fell across the room, I noticed him glance almost unconsciously toward the veiled mantelpiece, as though expecting the cloth to stir. He would smile faintly, shake his head, and turn again to his papers. It was clear that he meant, by an effort of will, to bury the past. I, too, longed for such peace, and for a time it seemed we had succeeded. Yet fate, or something older and less merciful, had not quite finished its reflection of us. The return of a familiar name. One morning, while I was engaged in sorting through my notes of the recent tragedy for the purposes of eventual publication, the post arrived with an envelope addressed in a neat foreign hand. Holmes, who had been reading at the window, tore it open absently. The paper was heavy, faintly tinted with blue, and bore the seal of the French Sûreté. Monsieur Holmes, permit that I recall our brief acquaintance in Paris some years ago. It may interest you to learn that certain papers relating to an English invention of optical nature, bearing the name Penhaligon, have lately come to our attention. These were discovered in a trunk purchased at auction from the estate of a deceased chemist. The diagrams are incomplete, yet one bears an inscription: "To be perfected only by the one who sees through another's eye. I would value your counsel as to its authenticity. The Inspector Dubosc, Sûreté Nationale." Holmes read the letter twice, then let it fall upon the table. "Watson," said he, "the shadow lengthens again." I sighed. "Do you mean to pursue it?" He gave a short, sardonic laugh. "Pursue it? No, but we cannot pretend that the ghost is laid until we know by what road it travels. Fetch my hat. France, I think, owes us an explanation." Paris and the lost trunk. Within 48 hours we were in Paris. The city was wreathed in early winter mist, the Seine glinting coldly between the bridges. At the Sûreté, Inspector Dubosc, a small, keen man with the alert manner of a terrier, received us with Gallic courtesy and barely concealed curiosity. He produced the trunk, a battered, iron-bound chest, its lock newly forced. Within lay several rolls of parchment, brittle with age, and a handful of brass instruments, lenses, screws, and a cracked ocular tube. Holmes examined the papers under the light. "This," he said softly, "is indeed Penhaligon's hand. See here, the spiral notations, the shorthand formulae for reflection and refraction. But this edition, to be perfected only by the one who sees through another's eye, that is not his. The ink differs. The phrasing is foreign." Dubosc inclined his head. "We thought so. It appears to be the work of a man called Ernst Haydn, a Prussian physicist once employed by your optician, Quarles." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Then Quarles was not the final link. Haydn. I have read of him. A recluse, obsessed with the notion that perception itself is divisible, that one mind might through optical means share the sight of another." He turned to me. "Do you see, Watson? The Ordo Speculorum was but one branch of a wider tree. They sought unity of vision, the perfect observer who sees through all eyes at once. The glass-eyed man, the mirror that dreams, all mere experiments along the way." The Laboratory of Shadows. At Holmes's insistence, we accompanied Dubosc to the small suburban villa where Haydn had lived and died. The place stood at the edge of Montreuil, a forlorn building with boarded windows and a garden choked by weeds. Inside, the air was thick with dust and chemical fumes long settled. We found in the upper room a kind of workshop, A wooden chair stood before a tall contrivance of lenses and wires, part telescope, part camera obscura. At its center, mounted like an idol, was a small round mirror of black glass. Holmes bent over it with evident caution. "Obsidian," he murmured. "Volcanic, ancient, not man-made." He gestured for me to bring the lantern closer. The mirror's surface drank the light, reflecting nothing. Yet as we moved, faint shapes began to glimmer across its depths, indistinct, shifting, like silhouettes behind smoke. Dubosc crossed himself. "Mon Dieu, it moves." Holmes remained motionless. "Yes," he said quietly. "It moves, but only because we do. This is no optical trick, Watson. It is a negative reflection, the absence of light arranged to mimic form. Haydn sought to create the eye of darkness, the lens that sees not light but thought." He turned sharply to the inspector. "Destroy it." Dubosc hesitated. "But surely, monsieur." "Destroy it," Holmes repeated, "or Paris will find itself haunted by its own imagination." The inspector, overawed, summoned his men. Within minutes the apparatus lay in pieces, the black mirror shattered by the butt of a rifle. Yet as we descended the stairs, I fancied I heard from somewhere above a faint sound, not of breaking glass, but of something sighing, as though released. The philosophy of seeing. We dined that night at a quiet café near the Rue de Rivoli. Holmes was unusually reflective, if one may use so ironic a word. He spoke little, but when he did, his tone had none of his old irony. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever wondered what sight truly is? Not merely the act of perceiving, but the consciousness behind it. When I observe a footprint in the mud, I see by inference the man who made it, his height, his weight, his occupation. But the mirror, the dreaming glass, invites another kind of seeing. It asks one to become the other mind. That is its blasphemy." I nodded gravely. "And Haydn? He failed, thank God, for had he succeeded there would be no more secrets, no more individuality. Humanity would be but one vast reflection, endlessly observing itself. The perfect vision, and the death of all privacy." He raised his glass of wine, though he did not drink. "We have destroyed the mirror twice, Watson. Once in Lambeth, once in Montreuil. Let us hope there is no third. The farewell of the glass." We returned to London after a week. Holmes was silent on the journey, gazing out the window as the grey fields slid by. Only when we reached Baker Street did he seem to rouse himself. "Watson," said he, "you will of course write this up. But not yet. Let the world forget the glass-eyed man and his heirs. One day science will reinvent the same peril under another name, and men will call it progress. Until then, silence is the better safeguard." I promised him that I would wait. That night, as I retired, I passed by the sitting-room door. Holmes sat by the fire, his violin upon his knee, his face calm and thoughtful. The flame-light danced upon the polished wood of the instrument, a new one recently acquired. For an instant, I could have sworn it. The light caught the curve of the varnish, and a second reflection stirred there, faint as breath, looking not at Holmes but at me. I blinked. It was gone. Holmes did not look up. He merely said in that gentle, weary voice which always marked the end of a case, "Sleep well, Watson. The night is clear. No fog, no mirrors." And with that he drew the bow across the strings. The music rose, pure, untroubled, and achingly human. So ended the long and terrible history of the glass-eyed man, a tale of sight and blindness, of truth glimpsed and wisely forgotten. Yet even now, when the lamps burn low and I hear a violin echo faintly through the London night, I sometimes fancy that somewhere, deep within that melody, the glass still dreams and remembers. Chapter 3. The Silent Watcher. The long winter that followed our return from Paris proved one of the quietest seasons I can recall in all my association with Sherlock Holmes. London lay under a pall of low cloud, its streets shining with frost, its lamps burning pale through the mist. Within the familiar walls of Baker Street, life resumed its customary rhythm. Tea at 7, correspondence at 8, and the sound of Holmes's violin drifting faintly from the sitting-room long after midnight. Outwardly, it might have seemed that the shadows cast by the glass-eyed affair had finally retreated into memory. Yet beneath that veneer of calm I sensed in Holmes a subtle change, more profound than illness and deeper than melancholy. He was quieter, yes, but not idle. His gaze, once restless and analytic, had grown distant, not the absorption of a thinker lost in deduction, but the abstraction of a man listening to something unheard. I once asked him if his mind was occupied with a new case. He gave a short laugh. A case, my dear Watson? No, a condition. The curious circumstance of a man who knows that the world may be an optical illusion and must live as if it were real. Then, catching my alarm, he added more gently, "Forgive me. The mirror leaves one philosophical aftertaste, that is all." The visitor in the fog. It was near the year's end when an unexpected caller roused the quiet of our household. A heavy snow had fallen, muffling the street and turning the lamps into halos of mist. We were seated by the fire when a firm knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered moments later, bearing a card upon a tray. Holmes took it and raised an eyebrow. Inspector Lestrade. I had begun to think him a myth of Scotland Yard folklore. The inspector was ushered in, stamping the snow from his boots and shaking the cold from his coat. His familiar sharp features wore a look half apologetic, half perplexed. "Beg pardon for intruding, Mr. Holmes," he said, "but I've a matter that, well, the men at the yard thought it might tickle your fancy." Holmes gestured toward the hearth. "You seldom bring me trivialities, Inspector. What corpse has refused to stay buried this time?" Lestrade hesitated. "None, sir. Not a corpse. Not yet, anyhow. But there's something queer afoot at the National Gallery. Night watchmen swear they've seen a figure walking in one of the closed rooms. A reflection, as it were, without a source. Appears only in the glass of certain display cases. Never in the same one twice." I felt a chill run through me. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. A reflection without a body. How poetically inexact, and how uncomfortably familiar. Lestrade spread his hands helplessly. "They think it's a trick of the light. I'd say so myself if the same shadow hadn't been caught by the cameras. No body, no man, just, well, something in the glass." Holmes was silent for several seconds. When he spoke, it was in that soft tone I had come to dread. "When did it begin?" 3 weeks ago. Always after midnight. The attendants call it the Watcher. Some of them have quit outright." "The Watcher," Holmes repeated. He rose abruptly. "Watson, your coat. The night grows interesting." The gallery at midnight. We arrived at the National Gallery near midnight. The porter, pale and nervous, admitted us without protest. He led us through the echoing halls, our footsteps muffled upon the marble. The gas lamps flickered against the gilt frames of Turner and Constable, casting long, tremulous shadows across the silent masterpieces. Lestrade's voice was a hoarse whisper. "This way, Mr. Holmes. The apparition favors the east wing, the old portrait gallery." Holmes said nothing. His face, half lit by the lamps, had taken on that familiar aspect of keen absorption I had not seen for weeks. Yet there was something else there too, an unease he did not trouble to hide. We reached the long corridor. The air was bitterly cold, though no window was open. A dozen glass display cases lined the walls, each containing minor relics, sketches, palettes, scraps of frame. The porter halted and pointed. "There, sir. That's where it showed itself last, in the glass of that case." Holmes approached slowly. The light glimmered faintly across the surface. For a moment nothing stirred. Then, almost imperceptibly, the reflection of Holmes's own face shifted. He froze. I saw it too. The image in the glass was smiling. Holmes drew a long, steady breath. "Watson, fetch your revolver." I obeyed, my hands trembling. But as I turned back, the smile had vanished. The reflection was once more his own. Lestrade muttered an oath. "It's witchcraft, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's voice was quiet but firm. "No, not witchcraft. Persistence. Memory imprinted upon the surface. The last echo of the dreaming glass, reborn in another form." He ran his gloved hand lightly across the case. "You see, Inspector, the National Gallery purchased a number of experimental lenses from the late Penhaligon's estate some years ago. They were used to enhance illumination, perhaps even reflection. It appears one of them has remembered too much. The reflection moves." He knelt to examine the edge of the case. "A faint residue of mercury nitrate. The same compound Penhaligon used. The glass has developed what I might call a memory of perception. It reflects not what is before it, but what it has once seen." Lestrade blinked. "Then this shadow?" "Is nothing but a recollection," said Holmes. "Yet recollections can be dangerous things when they do not know they are dead." At that instant the light flickered, the air grew colder still, and from the far end of the corridor came a faint sound, not footsteps, but a soft tapping, as of knuckles upon glass. We turned as one. Every pane along the gallery shimmered faintly, as though lit from within. Then in each a figure appeared, tall, indistinct, yet horribly familiar. A man with one shining eye. "Dunwoody," I breathed. Holmes's voice cut through the silence. "Stand fast. Do not look directly into it." The reflections moved closer, their forms flickering like candlelight upon water. For a heartbeat they filled the glass. Then, as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. The corridor was empty. Lestrade stumbled back, white-faced. "I'm finished with this, Mr. Holmes, finished. You can keep your ghosts." Holmes watched him go. Then very softly he said, "Not ghosts, Watson. Remnants. The glass has learned to dream again." The silent watcher. We returned to Baker Street in silence. The first light of dawn crept over the city, cold and colorless. Holmes stood by the window, his profile etched against the gray sky. "It follows a law, you see," he murmured. "The mirror cannot die while the mind that looked into it survives in memory. So long as one man remembers, the reflection endures. The world itself is a hall of mirrors." He turned toward me then, and in the pale morning light I saw something that chilled me more than any apparition. For in his eyes, those brilliant, restless eyes that had seen through every disguise and deception, there lingered just for an instant a faint metallic gleam. Then it was gone, and he smiled his old weary smile. "Come, my dear fellow, we have survived worse illusions. The world will not end because one mirror remembers." Yet even as he spoke, I knew he did not believe it. Epilogue to the chapter. The National Gallery closed that wing for repairs within the week. The papers made no mention of the incident. Life on Baker Street resumed its steady rhythm, the clink of teacups, the scratch of Holmes's violin bow, the murmur of handsome wheels upon the fog-bound street. But sometimes, when the light is low and I pass the window at dusk, I fancy I see him still, a tall figure standing motionless by the glass, his head slightly bowed, his gaze fixed upon something only he can see. And as the firelight flickers across his face, it seems to me that Holmes himself has become what he once hunted, the silent watcher, forever peering into the depths of his own reflection, listening for the faint music of the dreaming glass. Chapter 14. The Vanishing Reflection. The case that the public would one day call the glass-eyed affair might well have ended with that strange visitation at the National Gallery, but fate, or some darker hand, seldom permits Sherlock Holmes a tranquil conclusion. I had hoped, after the silent watcher incident, that Holmes would allow the matter to fade into the background of legend, as many of his cases have done. Yet I should have known better. There was a glint in his eyes, not of triumph, but of something unresolved, almost haunted. The winter passed into a brittle, colorless spring. Our work resumed its ordinary course. Clients with jealous wives, vanishing jewels, and blackmailers who lacked imagination. Yet even amid the trivialities, I often caught Holmes gazing absently at the fogged window panes of Baker Street, his long fingers tapping the sill in slow rhythm, as though listening to the echo of a sound only he could hear. One evening, after the close of a tiresome domestic case, I found him thus seated by the hearth, his violin resting across his knees. The firelight threw his shadow tall upon the wall, a perfect silhouette, motionless save for the faint rise and fall of his breath. He spoke without turning. "Watson, do you believe that a shadow can outlive the man who casts it?" I looked up from my notes, startled. "You mean metaphorically, Holmes?" "Perhaps not." He smiled faintly. "A shadow is but the absence of light shaped by the body that blocks it. But what if the body itself becomes unnecessary? If light learns to cast its own?" "Holmes," I said, "you are perilously near to poetry." "Or madness," he replied, still smiling. "It is a narrow bridge between the two." A message in silver. It was 3 nights later when Mrs. Hudson brought up the evening post. A single envelope, heavy, unmarked, its surface faintly glimmering as though brushed with fine metallic dust. Holmes, who was trimming his lamp, held the letter to the light. No seal, no watermark. Curious. He slid it open with his penknife. A single sheet slid out, bearing only a line of elegant script. "The reflection fades when the watcher sleeps." Holmes frowned, turning the paper over. "Invisible ink, perhaps," he murmured. He held it closer to the lamp, and at once the faint dust upon its surface shimmered. The words vanished. In their place appeared another phrase, faint, silver-gray, like writing seen through frost. "Haydn lives." We stared at one another. "Haydn?" I whispered. "But he died years ago. You saw his laboratory destroyed." Holmes's gaze darkened. "So I believed. Yet if any man could survive his own experiment, it would be one who had learned to see through others' eyes. Come, Watson. The game returns to the board." The shadow in the glass. Our first clue came from Inspector Dubosc's follow-up telegram from Paris, which reached us 2 days later. It confirmed that Haydn's body had never been officially identified. A witness, a maid who had tended the villa, swore that she had seen her master leave the house that same evening, carrying a small mirror wrapped in cloth. The next morning the place had been found in ruins. "Then the laboratory we destroyed was but a shell," Holmes said grimly. "The true apparatus, his obsidian lens, must have survived." "Holmes?" I said uneasily. "Surely you don't mean to pursue this?" "My dear fellow, the question is not pursuit. It is containment. If Haydn has indeed preserved Penhaligon's work, then London is once more a hall of mirrors, and one man somewhere is standing at the center. The house in the fog. Our search led us to Wapping, that old haunt of fog and river damp, where the warehouses stand like blind giants along the wharves. An informant, one of Holmes's numerous agents in the underworld, had reported a foreign lodger, recently taken rooms above a disused glass factory on Pennington Street. We arrived just after dusk. The fog clung thick around the gas lamps, and the air smelt of tar and cold iron. Holmes examined the pavement with his lantern, tracing footprints, heavy-soled, narrow-gated. "A man accustomed to confinement," he murmured. "See the toes. They turn inward, the walk of one who seldom meets the sun." The door to the warehouse was ajar. Holmes motioned for silence and drew his revolver. We climbed a narrow stair to the upper room. A single candle burned upon a table. Before it, propped against a wall, stood a small mirror covered by black velvet. Holmes advanced cautiously. "Haydn?" he called. No answer. He reached for the cloth and froze. "Watson," he whispered. "The candle." Its flame burned steady, yet its reflection in the glass flickered as if disturbed by wind. He dropped the cloth. The mirror's surface was no longer black, but luminous, a deep shifting silver alive with motion. Within it, faint and wavering, stood the image of a man, tall, spare, bald, the very likeness of Haydn, though his features were drawn and hollow, as if half formed from smoke. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes," said the image. The voice was calm, distant, yet filled the room as though spoken from the air itself. Holmes stood rigid. "So you persist?" "I am persistence," the image replied. "You destroyed my body, but not my sight. I see through you now, through all who have looked into the glass. You are my eyes." Holmes's hand tightened on his revolver. "You forget, sir, that eyes may be closed." He fired. The glass shattered. The sound was unlike any I had heard, not the ring of breaking mirror, but a low, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate through the bones. The candle guttered out. When the smoke cleared, the mirror was gone, not shattered on the floor, but gone as though it had sunk into the wall itself. Holmes stood very still, the revolver smoking in his hand. "He is finished," he said quietly. Yet his voice trembled, and yet I think he has taken something with him. The vanishing reflection. We left the warehouse in silence. The fog pressed close around us as we hailed a cab. It was only when we reached Baker Street that I noticed it. As Holmes hung his coat, his shadow upon the wall seemed oddly faint, almost transparent. "Holmes," I said uneasily, "you are pale. Sit. You look unwell." He smiled faintly. "No, Watson, not unwell, only diminished." "Diminished? Do you not see? When I fired, the reflection did not merely vanish, it transferred. Haydn sought to merge observer and observed. He has done so. Some part of me, perhaps the part that looked too long, remains behind that glass." "Holmes, this is madness." "Perhaps." He sank into his chair, staring into the fire. "But I feel it. A quietness, as though a second self has been extinguished. I am in a sense less than I was. And yet—" He hesitated. "And yet freer." The final reflection. For weeks thereafter, life resumed its ordinary shape. The newspapers mentioned a mysterious explosion at a riverside warehouse, but nothing more. The case was officially closed. One evening I entered the sitting room to find Holmes standing before the window, his reflection faint in the glass. The city lay beyond, fog and lamplight, endless and unknowable. He turned to me with a strange gentleness. "Watson," he said, "if ever you write this case, and I know you will, do not call it the story of the glass-eyed man, nor of mirrors and ghosts. It is the story of seeing, of what happens when one looks too long into truth. The mirror did not kill those men. It merely showed them themselves." He smiled, a weary human smile that dispelled for a moment the lingering dread. "Now come, my dear fellow. There's a storm coming over the river, and Mrs. Hudson's supper grows cold." I followed him, glad of the warmth and the light. Yet as I turned to close the shutters, I caught one last glimpse of his reflection in the window. Or thought I did. For just an instant the glass showed two figures where one stood. Then the fog rolled past, and the second shape was gone. Thus ended the case of the glass-eyed man, a tale I have long hesitated to set upon paper, for fear it might be taken as the delusion of an aging physician, or the nightmare of a man too long in the company of a genius who gazed always beyond the veil. Whether Holmes truly lost some fragment of himself in that final confrontation, or whether it was but my own imagination playing tricks upon a weary mind, I cannot say. But sometimes, when the fog drifts low across Baker Street and the firelight glimmers faintly upon the window, I fancy that if I were to look long enough into that dim reflection, I might yet see him there, lean, ascetic, eternal, the silent watcher who once saw too much, and learned at last that some truths are best left unseen. Chapter 15. The Final Observation. It is a melancholy fact that the longer one lives in the company of genius, the more one learns that triumph and tragedy are often twin reflections of the same flame. In the early months of the year 1890, as the last traces of the glass-eyed affair faded from public recollection, I believed that Holmes had at last shaken free of its darker associations. Yet, as ever, I mistook composure for peace. The city was greening again, handsome wheels splashed through spring rain, and London had begun to hum with its customary industry. Our sitting room on Baker Street was bright with sunlight for the first time in months. Holmes had taken to wearing his dressing gown of Persian blue once more, a small detail, but to me it signified recovery. Yet there were moments when, catching him unaware, I saw that same faraway look steal over his countenance, the expression of a man listening to the silence beyond sound. The mirrors remained covered. I did not press him to uncover them. The case of the missing astronomer. One morning in early April, while I was examining a patient, Holmes received a visitor, a tall, angular man with an astronomer's stoop, and the anxious eyes of one accustomed to studying infinities. I found them seated by the fire when I returned. "Watson," said Holmes, "permit me to present Professor Aldous Greening, lately of the Royal Observatory. He has brought us a matter which, though it masquerades as a simple disappearance, bears the unmistakable perfume of reflection." The professor inclined his head. "A colleague of mine, Dr. Lionel Ashe, vanished last week. We found his observatory locked from within, his telescope intact. But the lens, gentlemen, the great lens itself, was blackened as though by fire. On the wall behind it, where no light could reach, there appeared the outline of a human figure, burned or perhaps etched into the plaster. Holmes's eyes gleamed, etched by light that should not exist. Continue, Professor." "The police think it an accident with the photographic plates," said the man. "But Ashe had lately been corresponding with the late Edmund Dunwoody. Your name appears in his notes, Mr. Holmes, about some optical principle. He spoke of a mirror that sees. I thought it nonsense until I saw that wall." Holmes rose with sudden energy. "The final experiment," he murmured. "Watson, it appears the dreaming glass has found a new pupil. The observatory on the hill. We journeyed that afternoon to the outskirts of Greenwich, where the disused observatory stood upon a low rise overlooking the river. The air smelled of rain and stone. Gulls circled overhead like fragments of torn paper. Inside, the chamber was cold and silent. The telescope loomed like a cannon aimed at heaven. Holmes examined the great lens with meticulous care, running his fingers along its rim. "Do you see, Watson?" he said quietly. "A thin layer of silvering upon the inner glass. Not soot, but deposition. The same mercury compound Penhaligon used. Dr. Ashe has repeated his work upon a grander scale." We turned toward the rear wall. There, unmistakably, was the outline the professor had described, the faint, perfect silhouette of a man, arms slightly raised as though reaching toward the telescope. The edges glimmered faintly in the gloom. Holmes stooped, his expression unreadable, not burned, but imprinted. The man's image, his very presence, fixed upon the wall like a negative. He looked through the lens when it turned from earth to sky. The dreaming glass has shifted its gaze from man to the heavens. He straightened abruptly. "Watson, do you realize what this means?" He tried to make the sky itself a mirror. A glimpse of the infinite night fell as we examined the dome. Holmes, ever the experimenter, could not resist. Aligning the telescope, he adjusted the dials, peered into the eyepiece, and beckoned me forward. "Look," he said simply. I hesitated. The memory of Lambeth's horrors still lived in me, yet his tone brooked no argument. I bent to the glass. At first I saw only the stars, pinpoints of silver across a fathomless dark. Then slowly they began to move, or rather my own reflection began to move among them. I saw my face, ghostly and pale, suspended in the void, and behind me another, Holmes's, watching intently. Then his image turned, though the man beside me had not. I recoiled with a cry. Holmes caught my arm. "Steady, Watson. It is but the mind's echo, the same trick that haunted Dunwoody's eye. The heavens reflect what we bring to them." "But you saw it," I gasped. "I saw what I expected to see," he said quietly, "and perhaps that is the greatest danger of all. that the mirror shows not truth, but belief. He covered the lens with a cloth. Come, the stars will keep their secrets tonight. The last deduction. We left the observatory before dawn. The first light broke over the Thames like tarnished silver. Holmes walked in silence, his coat drawn tight against the chill. At last he spoke. "Watson, I have been wrong." "My dear Holmes!" "Wrong in assuming that the dreaming glass was a curse confined to its makers. It is rather a mirror of mankind's condition, our unending hunger to see what lies beyond our sight. Penhaligon, Dunwoody, Haydn, Ashe, each sought knowledge, not evil. Yet in their pursuit they looked past wisdom into madness. The mirror did not corrupt them. It merely obeyed." He paused, gazing eastward where the river flamed under the rising sun. "It is not the mirror that dreams, Watson, but the mind. And perhaps the truest sanity is to turn one's gaze away." I said nothing. The wind off the water stirred the hem of his cloak, and for a fleeting instant his reflection shimmered upon the wet cobbles at our feet, thin, wavering, almost transparent. Holmes smiled faintly. "Do you know, my dear fellow, I sometimes think that if all the mirrors in the world were shattered, men might begin to see one another clearly for the first time." The final reflection. That evening back at Baker Street, Holmes packed away the last of his instruments. The covered mirrors remained untouched. The fire burned low, and he sat beside it, the shadows dancing upon his face. "You intend to publish nothing of this, Watson," he said suddenly. "Promise me." "I promise," I said, though my hand trembled. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Let the dreaming glass sleep. There are enough illusions in the world without my adding to them." He poured 2 glasses of brandy, handed me one, and raised his own. "To sight," he said. "To sight," I echoed. The fire crackled softly. For a time neither of us spoke. Then Holmes rose, stretched his long limbs, and stood by the away window. Outside, the fog was gathering once more, dimming the lamps along Baker Street until they glowed like ghosts in the mist. Holmes looked out into the grey. "Strange," he murmured, "how the fog obscures the world, and yet in its way spares us from seeing too much." He turned back with a small smile. "Come, Watson. The night is clear enough within these walls." And so it ended, the long pursuit of light through glass, of truth through reflection. Holmes never again spoke of the matter, but sometimes when the fog rolls thick and I see his shadow fall across the hearthrug, I fancy it lingers a moment too long after he has moved, as though the mirror of the world, reluctant to forget, still remembers the man who once dared to look through it. Chapter 15. The final curtain. It is with no small measure of hesitation that I set down this last chapter in the strange chronicle of the glass-eyed man. There are matters here that test the boundary between reason and imagination, between the solid world and that ghostly realm of reflections in which, I fear, my old friend was destined to dwell. Though years have passed since those events, I confess that even now a certain unease attends the memory of them. Holmes, for his part, never alluded again to the dreaming glass, or to the horrors which had sprung from its invention. He returned to his customary pursuits with renewed vigor, cases of fraud, espionage, and theft, which once more brought his brilliant faculties to bear upon the tangible world. Yet for all his apparent restoration, I knew that something indefinable had changed within him. His mind, though as sharp as ever, had acquired a new stillness, a contemplative quality foreign to his nature. He worked now not to prove his intellect, but as if to distract himself from something unseen, a memory perhaps that lurked at the periphery of his thoughts, like a phantom just beyond the reach of the lamplight. The storm over London. It was in late May, some 6 weeks after our return from Greenwich, that a great storm swept across London, the most violent I had seen in many years. The sky turned almost black at midday, and thunder rolled like cannon fire over the Thames. The city shuddered under the onslaught, Lightning forked over the rooftops, illuminating the river with sudden spectral brilliance. Holmes, curiously enough, appeared invigorated by the tempest. "Nature," he remarked, pacing before the window, "is the only true mirror. She reflects everything, and nothing." I smiled, though uneasily. "You have become a philosopher, Holmes." He turned toward me. "Perhaps it is safer to be a philosopher than a visionary." Before I could reply, the room was suddenly illuminated by a flash of lightning so blinding that for a moment I saw nothing but white. When my vision cleared, I beheld Holmes standing absolutely still by the window, his hand pressed to the glass. "Watson," he said softly, "come here." I rose, alarmed by the tone of his voice. He did not turn as I approached. "What is it?" "Look," he whispered. Outside, the street was empty. The rain poured in silver sheets. Yet upon the wet surface of the glass, just for an instant lit by the lightning's afterglow, there appeared another hand, pressed against his own from the outside. Then it was gone. The visitor in the rain. The following morning, Mrs. Hudson informed us that a gentleman had called during the storm, leaving no name but a card of strange design. Holmes examined it under the lens. It bore no lettering, only a faint engraving of an eye surrounded by concentric rings. "The ordo speculorum," he murmured. "Still they linger." "You think the order survives?" I asked. "I think," he said, "that ideas are harder to kill than men. When a man dies, his image remains, not only in glass, but in the minds of those who looked upon him. And ideas are nothing but reflections of reflections." He placed the card in the fire. "Let us leave it there." The case of the vanishing light. For several nights thereafter, Holmes worked late into the small hours, examining nothing more dangerous than the remains of a cigar ash or the footprint of a burglar. But one evening I woke to a sound I had not heard since that dreadful winter, the long low note of the violin. I went to the sitting room and found him standing by the hearth, bow in hand. The melody was unlike any I had ever heard, not mournful nor sweet, but eerily balanced between the two, as if poised upon the edge of remembrance. The firelight glowed upon his face, and in his eyes there burned a curious reflective light. "Holmes," I said quietly, "that tune, what is it?" He lowered the bow. "Something of my own making, Watson. A study in echoes." He smiled faintly. "Do you hear it?" "The melody?" "No. The space around it. The silence that follows each note. That is the true music." He set the instrument aside and sank into his chair. "You once asked me whether I feared madness. I do not. Madness is only the mind's reflection turned inward. What I fear," he said, gazing into the fire, "is the possibility that I might vanish entirely. Not die, you understand, but dissolve, like smoke against a mirror." The final observation. The last act of this strange history took place a few days later. A messenger brought word from Inspector Lestrade that Professor Greening, the astronomer who had first summoned us to Greenwich, had been found dead in his study. The manner of death was peculiar. The blinds drawn, the lamp extinguished, and upon the wall opposite his desk a faint luminous outline of his own face, as though impressed by light. Holmes said little. He merely dressed with his customary precision and bade me accompany him. The professor's house lay in Bloomsbury. The body was as described, slumped before a darkened window. The faint outline upon the plaster shone softly even in the lamplight. Holmes examined it in silence. At last he turned to me. "The contagion has spread." "You mean the mirror's curse?" "I mean perception itself. Every man who looks too deeply into his own image sees something that should not be seen. The dreaming glass was but the first instrument. The human eye is the last." He drew the curtain over the window and turned away. "Come, Watson. There is nothing more to learn here." The quiet departure. In the days that followed, Holmes grew uncommonly gentle in his manner, almost affectionate, though still reserved. He took long walks through Regent's Park, sometimes standing motionless by the lake for an hour, staring into the shifting reflections of clouds upon the water. Once I ventured to ask what occupied his thoughts. "The simplest of questions," he said, "whether the reflection of the sky upon water is more real than the sky itself. Perhaps the one exists only because the other observes it." I laughed. "You are becoming quite the mystic, Holmes." "Perhaps," he said softly. "But mysticism, my dear Watson, is merely logic seen from the other side of the glass." The final curtain. It was in early June that Holmes vanished. There was no struggle, no sign of departure. His pipe lay cold upon the mantel, his violin in its case. The fire had burned low. Only one thing was out of place. The curtain over the window had been drawn aside. When I approached, I saw my own reflection gazing back, and behind me, faint and wavering, another. Holmes's tall, lean figure, his head slightly inclined as if in perpetual thought. I turned, but the chair was empty. I searched the room, the building, the street. No trace of him was ever found. Scotland Yard concluded that he had left for the continent on some secret errand. I allowed them their explanation. Yet I knew, as surely as I have ever known anything, that Sherlock Holmes had at last stepped beyond the mirror's reach, into that place where observation ends and reflection begins. Epilogue. The glass at dawn. Years have passed since that night. I have grown older, slower, perhaps a little more inclined to dream. The world has changed, electric light has replaced the gas lamps, and London has grown louder, brighter, and less mysterious. But sometimes, in the still hour before dawn, when the rain runs down the window and the city sleeps, I see, upon the glass, a faint image, tall, lean, and motionless, his face illuminated by a light that is not of this world. Then, as the day breaks, the image fades, leaving only the reflection of an old man with a pen in his hand. Yet I cannot help but feel that somewhere, beyond sight, beyond even reason, Holmes still watches, the eternal observer, the guardian of the unseen truth. And if ever again London's fog grows thick, and its mirrors begin to dream, I know he will return, as inevitable as thought, as silent as light, to remind us that the world itself is but an endless case, waiting to be solved.